Okay, let's see. Let's just double check we're actually live on YouTube.
Okay. Oh, there it is. Yep.
In fact, we are live. So, hello to the 0 viewers currently watching the stream. We are going to be doing a tier ranking of United States presidents for this President's Day because we have no lives and it's what we feel like doing. I'm So, do we want to introduce ourselves first, or what?
Yeah, I'm online. I am Adam DRB. Real name is Nick. I prefer going by Adam DRB though. For any viewers that might see this in the chat. I do rap battles on YouTube occasionally. I work at Subway. That's like my whole personality, basically.
Okay, well, we have Nick from Marvel versus Anything, the esteemed YouTube channel with one history-related video and hopefully more in the future. I'm Eric. I'm a history major at the University of Utah. Proud American, and according to my father, a filthy goddamn liberal. So we are going to be just going through all the rankings of the U.S. presidents. We may not get through all of them today, but we are going to see what we can do. Some things we discussed beforehand on distinctions from most presidential tier lists is we are going to be limiting how many we can put into each tier. So for S tier, we will have 1. S plus, I mean. S tier, we will have 3. A tier, we will have 5. B through D will be just evenly distributed 7. And then same inverse for the bottom. So that's so we don't just end up with a stack of all our favorite presidents in S plus, all the ones we dislike at the very bottom, just to keep things a bit more fair and balanced.
Yeah, we have to think about it a little bit like harder. Like consider, yeah.
The other major differences is we're going to be, these are my hot takes, we're going to be ranking Cleveland's 2 administrations separately because I think there are some clear distinctions between them. And I am not going to stand for having Taylor, Garfield, and Harrison being unranked. I think you can clearly see, at least from their plans for their presidency, and rank off of that instead of just copping out and being I won't rank them, which most other rankings like this do, or simply drop them into a low tier because they weren't alive long enough to accomplish anything.
Oh man, we already got a lot of people. Look at that.
Holy shit! How many do we have? 6 whole people. Wow.
Wow.
Wow, that's 6 more. That's more than the amount of friends I have in real life. So let's go. So, okay, we're gonna start off from the top. I'm assuming
with George, old cherry tree George.
We'll just put him in B for middling purposes while we rank them.
So personally, where I'm leaning towards with George Washington is probably. Maybe my opinion will change later, but I'm thinking he's a pretty clear S or potential S plus. I feel like it might be kind of cheap because he's like the first one, right? But it's like
you never forget your first.
He didn't. It's not like he like really like messed anything up. I feel like, or did anything that was like he set the groundwork pretty clearly.
I mean, I will agree to that. I mean, Washington is definitely like bottoms out at S tier. I think there are some limiting factors from declaring him best president outright. Those largely are going to come down to, the continued issue of slavery in the colonies. I'm not really okay. We should probably decide this now. Are we going to judge the personal issue of slavery, of personal ownership on this
That
list? I
is
don't really,
a good question.
because if
Uh,
so, that it will affect Washington. But even beyond that, there are some points on slavery that will affect some early administrations
I'm gonna say that we should probably rank it with that in mind
with
because
personal
I think that
ownership,
uh
or just with effects on like the continuation.
like the personal ownership and effect that it had in slavery. I mean, like, because I think that's gonna be like a big part of like Jefferson's too in the future. Thinking about that, it
Yeah.
is.
Okay. If we want to do that, I think that is definitely a strike against Washington, because if we do want to do personal reputation, he did deliberately make it so his slaves would not be freed when they came to Pennsylvania. He found legal
Yeah,
loopholes to maintain that. Um, Outside of that, he's going to see the Northwest Ordinance, which will and oversee the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. So a lot of people give crap to like right before the Civil War with the Fugitive Slave Act, but it was already enshrined in the Constitution under Washington's administration. The only other major downside I see to Washington is his failure to prevent political parties, which was an explicit goal of his.
yeah. No, that's
So,
definitely true.
and I think when, and it's, I think a lot of Americans nowadays, when we look at our democracy, we're very critical of the two party system. And the reason we arise into a two party system is because we don't account for the formation of parties in the design of our systems, which is largely attributed to, you know, the Congress in the design of the Constitution, which Washington was overseeing, and the precedents he set in his first term. So that is the main limiting factors from S plus. But he's still, we get the establishment of the federal government. We see amnesty for the Whiskey Rebellion, which basically keeps the entire country together. He he organized what a cabinet is supposed to be, because there were very little specifics of that in the actual Constitution. It's and he's the one responsible for normalizing relations with Britain.
Yeah.
And it's like, even it's do you know much about the Jay Treaty?
No, fill me in. I might know
So
it.
so the Jay Treaty was at the time what everyone knocked Washington for, because it was what normalized relations with Britain. It settled disputes of forts along the Canadian frontier.
Oh, gotcha, gotcha. Okay.
At the time, people were so riled up and anti-British that there were riots outside of Washington's home, like calling him a traitor and a coward for agreeing to John Jay's treaty with Britain. The fact that he was able to maintain some political unity during that and was able to hold the country together, I mean, without him, I don't think the essentially alliance of states remains united for very long.
Yeah, I think that's probably I think the biggest point towards he was just I feel like in general an exceptional leader and very powerful. Uh, it it is kind of a cop out I think, but like putting him like this high I think is just got to be like kind of justified because of the fact that I think if it was like anybody but Washington first, it probably would have gone south pretty fast.
Yeah. I think that takes us to his successor, John Adams.
Uh, not as great, I will
Definitely
say.
so. What is your general hot take on Adams?
My hot take on Adams right now is I was leaning towards low C or high D. I think he I can't think of actually so I think John something that was pointed out to me when I was doing the research uh is that our relationship with France uh John Adams was actually pretty integral to that. It probably would have gone very differently in the future. But I think other than that, it's not nearly as.
Yeah, so
I
Adams is
feel like.
kind of mixed on that because he resolves that largely at the end of his presidency, but the whole French relationship is in crisis throughout the rest of his presidency. He resolves it in 1800, but before that, we have open quasi war with France, with ships firing at each other willy nilly, diplomatic affairs. The XYZ affair becomes very public, where it's like American diplomats are getting snuffed abroad, and he is
Mm,
unable to really do anything about that. In truth, it's like the one thing keeping him above water from being a terrible president is his appointment of John Marshall to the Supreme Court, because I think we'll
mm.
see in Jefferson's administration the Marshall Court is going to be pivotal to the establishment of the early republic and the continuation of a federalist style government.
All right. I think his spot here in D is definitely very fair. Then I uh, I don't really have anything else to add. I think that sums it up pretty well.
Okay. That takes us to Jefferson, famous for the Louisiana Purchase, the Declaration of Independence, and owning a lot of slaves and having
Yeah.
relations with many of those slaves. Um,
uh,
it should be noted at the time Jefferson was fairly more liberal on the issue. He and many Virginians were the ones who proposed the end of the slave trade with the expectation that would eventually end slavery, and that was opposed by more deep Southerners rather than the Virginian aristocracy.
so I think I was on the fence. I think he's probably. I think B plus is probably actually a pretty good. I or maybe just B. I think is where I'm
Yeah,
kind of
so
leaning somewhere in that area.
where I would usually put him is, we're going to have Jefferson as he would be kind of B, but then there's some stuff that, like I talked about, runs into the Marshall Court.
Yeah.
Because during Jefferson's administration, we're going to have four major things that he kind of gets the opposite of what he wants, but ends up being better for the nation. We have the establishment of judicial review in Marbury v. Madison when he's trying to get rid of John Adams' midnight appointments. He will attempt to try his vice president Aaron Burr for treason in uh, 1807, which does not go through and establishes the difficulty of laying a treason charge, which is important for the health of the nation.
Yeah, it's a very big deal.
We're also going
Uh,
to see he's going to try and kick out some Federalist judges during his first term and will be unable to do so, which ends up establishing the supposed apolitical position of the courts, at least for the large portion of American history. And while he attacks the national bank, he's never able to fully dissolve it, which ends up just kind of strengthening its institution. No one after him was going to really attack it like he does until Jackson.
I think when we were talking about this earlier, I think something else interesting to mention is that the fact that the Louisiana Purchase kind of went against his very idea. That's obviously like his biggest thing. But like I think going back to Adams, the way I see it, I don't feel like it lines up particularly to be like Jefferson's like biggest thing is that like that he did that, but it's also I think a decision that probably like literally every single president would make because it was just such an easy deal. And I think like a lot of the credit actually should probably go to, or not a lot of the credit, but like a little bit of the credit maybe should even go to Adams before, if we're just talking like this term personally, then I mean, but that's why I think he's probably I think he should stay where he is, right here in B plus.
So we'll have him B plus with potential to be bumped up to A depending on how things happen.
Yeah.
Okay. That takes us to James Madison, the next member of the Virginia dynasty, and my favorite founding father, personally. Too
James
bad he was
Madison.
a terrible president. His role in making the Constitution and especially establishing the First Amendment are pivotal.
Yeah.
But when
absolutely.
we come to his presidency, it is defined by the War of 1812. It takes up a majority of his presidency. He deliberately pushes for it. And one of the issues of the matter is that it was resolved in Britain. If he had been more patient, it is likely the War of 1812 could have been avoided or at least limited. But that was not the case. So we had a war we were honestly not quite ready for. We do have an establishment of a regular army due to Jefferson by this point, but little is done from either presidency to really organize it until after the war.
All right. In that case, then, how are you feeling? You say, oh, well, I guess the question is, does the effect that he had on the Constitution really count in this case, because it wasn't really during his presidency?
Yeah, we're judging by presidency, so that doesn't really rank him very highly.
Then
There are a few things that he is able to accomplish. He, like, and I have them listed here. He does reorganize the national bank, so it will last for another about decade. He gives the second charter. After the war, he is able to reorganize in a fairly effective regular army. He, with the kind of destruction of the Federalists, because the Federalists are more pro-Britain, so as soon as Britain loses the war, there is no real reason for a Federalist Party, and they're destroyed. He is able to kind of bring them into the Democratic Republican fold, which will help his successor, James Monroe. And he begins kind of there's going to be a theme for a while of expanding infrastructure with beginning the Cumberland Road, which is the first road connecting the Atlantic to the Mississippi wholly.
All right. Then I would say, do you think like B's fair then? And I guess
it's like it would be between B and C is the thing. I'm not sure exactly.
I'll say B for the sake
B
of being centrist.
Okay. Now we are now to the first president that was not a member of the founding fathers, James Monroe, most famous for his Monroe Doctrine, as well as the Missouri Compromise. He is the only president in U.S. history to be elected almost nearly as unanimously as Washington. His second run sees one protest vote for his Secretary of State, Quincy Adams, because no one wants to give him a unanimous election, because that would be seen as a slight against Washington.
So, just to remind me right now, off the top of my head, remind me specifically what the Monroe Doctrine did.
So the Monroe Doctrine is because, we see we're past Napoleon at this point, so most of Latin America has gained independence. Monroe basically iterates that America will protect the sovereignty of Latin America or of just the general Western Hemisphere. That's like European powers no longer have a role in the Americas. And this is going to be just kind of the common foreign policy until really, I would say, William McKinley.
Yeah. All right. I have a better idea.
He's going to further Madison's internal improvements. The big slight I'm going to say with him is he does start the Seminole Wars, which are some of the more bloody wars with Native Americans, and that takes place in Florida.
Oh, Captain Sham in the chat, he says A tier.
A tier.
Uh, yeah.
I would
How are
be
we feeling about that?
honestly, I would be willing for Monroe A tier. He is a majorly defining figure in American politics, even if some of his foreign policy might be more due to his Secretary of State, who we will get to next. He is definitely a defining figure in American politics.
All right. I think that's fair. Yeah. Uh, who is the next? That would be top of my head.
That is going to lead us to his successor, John Quincy Adams.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing is Adams is going to enter in a very contested state because in the election of 1824, there is no clear victor. It ends up with Adams, Clay, and Jackson being the runner-ups, those presented before Congress. Jackson has the plurality of the popular vote and the Electoral College, but Clay throws his weight behind Adams in exchange for position of Secretary of State, which at the time is seen up as a layup to president, which he will be heavily criticized for. This is the first election in American history where a president is not elected by the full popular consent of the governed, which is going to hit him hard. That's going to lead to essentially the establishment of the Democratic Party in opposition to him.
Really? Actually,
Yes.
didn't pick up on that at all.
That's based. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I was just thinking. Is there anything? So that's obviously the big effect that he had, but that is more like when he entered. Is there anything that he actually did cause specifically in his?
He's kind of the final step of bridging the gap of the first party system. You know, the Federalists, the son of John Adams, the most prominent Federalist, is now a Democratic Republican president. He's going to mostly continue what Monroe set out doing. So we're going to get some more I think what they're called is reciprocity treaties, basically normalization and trade rights with many European powers. But he will end up causing a trade war with Britain due to rising tariffs. Those tariffs do start under Madison and Monroe, but he is the one who raises them to the point that it's going to become an issue amongst the British public.
All right. That's pretty rough then, I think. All right, what are you feeling then in that case?
I'm honestly not too sure with him. I would be willing to put B plus or B. He doesn't really do enough legislatively to grab an A tier, which is, it's terrible to say because I think he was an excellent politician for the time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like he just isn't long-standing enough to really go above those. So I would say probably above Madison at least.
All right. I'll say yeah, put him above Madison in B. I think that makes sense to me.
And now we are going to get to the least controversial president in American history, Andrew Jackson.
Here we go.
So I'm just going to place him down so I don't have to keep holding that down. But so what can be said for Jackson in favor is he is going to moderate heavily on internal improvements. The Democrats ran against infrastructure or government influence in infrastructure, but he's going to heavily moderate to basically investing as long as infrastructure is between multiple states. So that is more limited than previous presidents, but it still does allow for growth of the national economy. The nullification crisis does prevent secession when South Carolina attempts to resist the tariffs established by Quincy Adams and essentially declares that federal laws do not apply if they don't want them to. He quickly sets an end to that. But beyond that, and maybe some arguments about the entry of mass politics and the furthering of democracy, more universalist male suffrage, we are going to get the Trail of Tears and Indian
Yep.
removal in direct violation of the Supreme Court, is what most people know about him. But I would
Yeah.
argue that in terms of like long-standing effects on the whole of the American public, there are three things that he does that is going to have even worse effects. He's going to cause the Panic of 1837 by
Yeah.
disbanding the National Bank and focusing entirely on hard money. That is going to cause a financial crisis that will affect well past even his successor's presidency, and he does that as he's leaving office. He establishes the spoils system, which is essentially the system where presidents will reappoint massive amounts of the federal government as soon as they enter office, usually on political patronage and donations. He's the one who establishes precedent for that, and we're not going to see that change until, well, that'll be contentious throughout the Gilded Age, is Jackson doing that. And he appoints the second Supreme Court justice we are going to mention today, Taney. Taney will be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court throughout the early portions of the Civil War, responsible for decisions such as Dred Scott, and part of the reason that the Supreme Court would not be a limiting factor, but more so a causal factor of the Civil War.
I will say, not playing devil's advocate, of course, but if we are talking about things that directly happened in their presidency, uh, he does sign the Indian Removal Act, but I don't think the Trail of Tears actually happens under his presidency. I think that does happen under the. Uh,
So portions of it occur under him. I believe the Cherokee, the deadliest single trail, occurs under Van Buren. My argument, I think it's fair to say, if they establish something that comes and bites you in the ass later, it's
all
important.
right,
We
yeah, and
gave
I think
that.
that's fair.
That's what kept John Adams out of F, is the Marshall Court, and we're
Yeah, yeah.
appointing the man who's going to put in the Taney Court, is going to establish these systems that are going to last for a long time. So
I think
I
in that case, he's probably a pretty clear D in my book, or maybe even nah. I think a D is pretty.
Okay, we'll place him in D, but he's going to be low D. Adams is
Yeah,
more
he's pro.
high D.
So remind, we only have how many Fs do we have?
So
We
Fs,
have
we will
five. Okay.
have 5 Fs. So we're going to have 8 people in our list of like worst presidents. And
Okay. Okay.
the way I imagine is we're probably going to be debating near the end which ones are going to get bumped down. I know at the top, I have 4 people in mind that could be competitive for S plus, and we'll probably just float them in the S tier until the end so we can make a final decision.
All right. In
Um,
that case, then I think it's fair to move Jackson down to F tier.
F. Okay. So that brings us to his successor, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren
Hmm.
is I'm curious, do you know the one fun fact about Van Buren?
He is the only U.S. president that did not have English as his first language.
That is correct. He is Dutch, in fact,
Hmm.
from the old Dutch families of New York, which many people do not think about because, history started in 1776.
Oh yeah, and people were not crazy about him. They would shout at him. They would be like, Van, the used up old man, and Martin Van Ruin.
Yeah, I see that
Actually,
in our comment section
yeah.
already, is Van Ruin.
Anyway,
So
sorry. You-
so Van Buren, he was a fairly effective politician prior to his presidency. I think really was there as a mediating force on Jackson, but he really fails to live past much of what Jackson establishes. There are a few slight positives to his presidency, but I really don't think they outweigh it. They mostly come down to things that I think would have been accomplished by many people in his same position. And that's largely his foreign policy is he doesn't drag us into a war with Britain when Canada has a series of revolts during his presidency, and he is able to establish the independent treasury for a short time, which is the answer to a lack of a national bank. Beyond
I
that,
see.
we're getting economic decline, continuance of the Trail of Tears, and this is a thing
Yeah,
that applies to Jackson as well, but it's very near the end. But the initiation of the gag rule in the House of Representatives, which limits discussion on slavery.
all right. In that case, then I think it's pretty fair to put him in F. I think that's a pretty strong.
Would we put him higher or lower than Jackson?
That is actually a. I feel like there's less. I feel like there's less positives. I don't know if like the negatives necessarily like outweigh like how directly harmful Jackson's was, but I feel like there's just like less to like say that's actually positive about what he.
That's fair.
But it could go
So
either way for me though, personally.
I think personally, because Jackson was the one who started most of those trends, I want to put him just above Jackson.
Okay, that's valid.
Because he wasn't necessarily the cause of a lot of the issues of his presidency. He just really failed to
Yeah, yeah,
meet them at the time.
and that is
Okay.
an important part of presidency is reacting to crisis. I feel like it's important to remember.
Okay, now we're going to get to William Henry Harrison, he who died in 30 days. So,
Well,
okay, so what I'm going to do is because most people just give a blanket, we cannot rank Harrison. I think that's a bit unfair. I want to kind of, yeah, someone's saying he's the greatest of all time. I want to list out kind of what the campaign promises were, stuff he didn't really mention, and then limiting factors that would have affected his presidency. So his main campaign promises is a reestablishment of the national bank and a move to more paper money, which would have increased the amount of money in circulation, made it easier for farmers and people less centered in the democracy or in the economy to have more economic power. He vowed to reverse the spoils system. He was not very clear on how he was going to do that, but he intended to, I suppose, make more limits on who the president could fire and appoint. And he promised deference to Congress, being a more limited president, and made a promise of a one-term presidency. He would not serve more than 4 years. He definitely did not break that promise.
who said politicians are liars?
Uh,
Uh,
so
uh, well, okay.
he did not mention very much any changes to tariffs, which, as we saw, are a big issue at the time. He didn't really give any specific stance on slavery, but he did advise to ignore agitation. So there was probably going to be very little movement on that issue, which for his time
Oh
is
yeah.
kind of fair. We're still only entering the 1840s, and he didn't really talk much about Indian affairs at the time. Um, the biggest limiting factors of his presidency is there were still those kind of expansions of democracy going on in the era of like more people entering into the voter base, which it would be unclear how he would react to that as we're getting into an era of mass politics. Because during his successor's presidency, we're going to start seeing for the rabid calls for the annexation of Texas.
Hmm.
Um, the ongoing Seminole War, that's still happening by this point. Kind of the last endings of the Trail of Tears. And there is a fairly large feud in the Whig Party as he enters, with Henry Clay, the leader of the party, wanting more control, which he was kind of relenting to, and how he was discussing how he was going to run the country. But then he appoints into his cabinet Clay's biggest rival, Daniel Webster. So there was possibility of tension within the Whig Party in his presidency that never got to come to fruition because of his death. And Clay, I can't find much detail on this, but there's like talk at the time of like Clay trying to move more to a parliamentarian system, but I'm not sure how that would really function in the context of American politics. But perhaps like a greater importance of the Speaker of the House as a national leader. Those are things that may have happened if Harrison had the chance to live.
Well, okay. Well, I think in that case, I mean, it doesn't necessarily sound like there's like a lot of like inherent negatives. It doesn't really sound like anything that he would have done would have been like majorly impactful, I feel like. If I'm reading right. I think probably, I guess, if B might honestly just be fair in that case. I don't want
Okay.
to just like go centrist, but I feel like it might just be the play.
Yeah, B is probably fair on him. I don't think if he had survived, I don't think he would really be remembered, but I
Yeah.
think we probably would have had slightly better development as a nation. We're going to get now to John Tyler. So John Tyler, where should I put people while we're ranking them so I don't just drop them in random spots? S plus for John
Uh,
Tyler.
uh,
Okay,
you could probably just put him in see me after class, and then or S plus, and we
let's put him
can
in see
down
me
rank.
after class. That's funnier. Okay, so Tyler is the first vice president to assume the office of the presidency. There is no law or constitutional. Um, it's a very thin argument when he makes that decision unilaterally, is what I'm saying. Uh, um, the first thing to happen in his presidency is the entirety of Harrison's cabinet resigns on the idea that Tyler will reappoint them as a show of confidence. He reappoints none of them and appoints his own new cabinet completely separate from Harrison's, and essentially abandons the entire Whig party. He had been a Democrat rather than a Whig for the majority of his life. He was very close to Jackson. He was pretty much put on the ticket to appeal to Jackson voters, and he completely abandoned the mandate he was given as president. Um, he refused to establish a new national bank, considering the Whigs had taken power and had destroyed the independent treasury, or were at least limiting it. And his refusal to sign any compromise on a bank, the USA was basically without any functional financial system, or at least a less functional one than any other period in its history. Uh, Panic of 1837 will continue through his presidency. Yeah, he is able to get some kind of foreign policy wins, depending on who you ask. He is able to negotiate the Maine border, the border of Maine with Canada, so that stabilizes that region. And then he takes the controversial move of annexing Texas. And there was a big push to annex Texas at the time, and he does do it after Polk has won the next election. So he's doing this decision, this massive decision with large ramifications for U.S. history in his lame duck period. It's arguable if he would have done this if Polk had lost the election and there wasn't a mandate to annex Texas. But considering just kind of how contrarian he was, I would not put it past him. He was also, and it's like I know we are supposed what our rule is based on the aspects of their presidency. He is the only president to swear allegiance to the Confederate States of America.
Oh yeah. I do remember that.
So that is one thing. He does betray the United States actively at some point. I
Mm,
Usually people list Texas as his biggest accomplishment, but I'm not sure if that really changes anything. It probably would have been done immediately by Polk after assuming
yeah,
office.
that's kind of what I'm getting to. Uh, I don't know. Do you think? What are you feeling kind of right now?
I mean, I personally I have a very vindictive attitude towards the Confederacy, not necessarily over slavery, but over just like people betraying the United States of America, betraying oaths
Yeah.
of loyalty, betraying all that. So I have a very personal disdain for John Tyler. I can see the argument for where our F tier is, but personally, I would put him honestly in the see me after class tier. I think he is a candidate for one of the worst presidents in American history because he's seen. I cannot think of another president that got elected and spent the entirety of their presidency destroying their own party.
All right, I think that's valid. Actually, I was kind of between F and C me after class too. I feel like this is pretty fair.
Okay, so that is going to put us into James K. Polk,
James
who
Polk.
is he is a very interesting figure. Um, I think I have a brief summary of Polk's political career and presidency right here. Be nobody compromise candidate, have opposition president endorse you, win landslide, accomplish all major campaign goals in one term, leave after one term, die in 3 months.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Okay, I do remember. Yeah, he's the only president to accomplish all of his campaign goals. I think,
So
especially.
yeah, he's very fascinating. So main thing that most people remember about him is the Mexican American War.
Yeah,
I think that is on both the best and worst side of his presidency, because one, we do gain vast swaths of territory, including California, Utah, just uh, Nevada, basically everything that we're going to be getting west of Texas, we are getting come because of Polk, and he's going to further that in the Oregon Treaty, where he's going to negotiate to split the Oregon Territory between Canada and America. Basically,
hmm
the man who defined the borders of the modern continental United States is James K. Polk. That being said, he did start the war under false pretense. He moved troops explicitly into territory that was known to be disputed without like any conversation to Mexico and provoked conflict so that he could declare to the American public, our troops have been fired upon our soil to promote the war. There is this kind of I think misconception that it's like the Civil War and debate over it doesn't begin until after Mexican American War. There is vast opposition in the North declaring the Mexican American War as a war for the preservation of slavery as it is being fought, as it is being declared. And that can't really be ignored. And that is like probably the most limiting factor because, yes, we are getting our most successful war in American history, but it's going to start leading directly into the Civil War. You could also argue some stuff about like things he could have done more in the war. Like we could have gained more, and also there's a situation down in the Yucatan Peninsula that he could have influenced more to America's advantage that he doesn't end up doing. That still being said, massive success in terms of national growth and the preservation of
yeah,
the nation. Um,
and very
beyond
fast too.
Yeah, very fast. It's like one term to accomplish all he accomplished. He does beyond that, he does have some domestic wins as well. Is he will reestablish the independent treasury, and that's going to last until Wilson. So Polk's the reason that we're still going to have kind of the system we have throughout until the end of the progressive era with the establishment of the income tax and all that. Um, he did have internal improvements kind of in the Jacksonian view of it's like as long as it's between the states. So we still do see fairly useful internal improvements, but he does veto a fair amount of infrastructure spending during his presidency. So there's an argument that he does set that back a hair. He does reduce the tariff, the Quincy Adams tariff, and establishes more trade with Britain. And British relations are going to be a very important factor leading up to the Civil War and during it.
Yeah. So, would you okay, so what I'm kind of feeling right now is probably, do you think high A would be fair? Or would you even like put him like higher or even like lower, I guess?
I think where we're at right now, he probably is at least on par with Jefferson. So I'd be willing to put him in A or B plus above Jefferson.
Okay.
Because like we are talking about the biggest expansion of America in history in terms of territorial gains, in terms of establishing relations with Britain, in terms of basically making the modern United States. James K. Polk is a necessary figure of like the presidents, the ones not in S tier, the one most responsible for America being recognizable today, especially where we live, is probably James K. Polk.
Yeah. All right. I think I would probably put him. I think A would probably be fair. That's where I'm kind of standing.
Okay. And now we get into the second person many people choose not to rank is Zachary Taylor. And I'm going to come out with my hot take right now of I think Zachary Taylor probably, while a moral man and has probably closer to the morals of our time, if he lasted longer in office, probably would have made the nation measurably worse and likely expedited the beginning of the Civil War.
All right.
So, Zachary, what do you know about Zachary Taylor?
I'll be real. This is probably one of the presidents that I know the least about specifically. I know that he liked the military. That
Yes,
is
so
pretty much where my understanding ends, though.
So Zachary Taylor is elected by the Whig Party because he is a successful general in the Mexican-American War. He is a Virginia slave-owning general, but he does oppose the expansion of slavery. So while there's the fight over the territories gained in the Mexican-American War begins under him, and his reaction is essentially to threaten the South. Now with Jackson, we gave points because he was able to quell it. Taylor was basically threatening to send federal troops against Texas to deal with the border because Texas was refusing to relinquish territory to Arizona or New Mexico, like the new territories that were being established. Taylor said he would send in troops and quash the Texas government into obeying the federal ordinance. Beyond that, he also worsens relations with other nations. This is where we gotta. Do you know much about the revolutions of 1848?
No.
Okay, so
I'm not really familiar with that.
Okay, so the year Taylor is elected, we see a series of democratic revolutions erupt across Europe, such as in Germany, where they're trying to establish a German federated state. In Hungary, where they're trying to gain independence from Austria. In France, we see Napoleon III becoming president. Essentially, all across Europe, there's a series of these liberal revolts, liberal and nationalist, because those kind of went hand in hand at the era, strangely to our modern sensibilities. Taylor's response was to kind of openly side with these largely failed rebellions, which just pissed off Europe.
I see.
So that's worsening relations. So we're antagonizing the South and worsening relations with other countries. Meanwhile, we start seeing the beginning of filibusters as we're seeing private American citizens traveling to random Caribbean and Central American countries in attempts to establish future slave states. And I don't know really how he would have reacted to their continued expansion throughout his presidency, because he's balancing this fervent American nationalism with hatred for the expansion of slavery. There's one other thing I have written down here that I just need to double check. But so far, I think if he had stayed in power, the only real benefit is we see the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. He does benefit relations with Britain. Basically, what that does is Britain states that they're not going to have any interest in Central America, but we can see that they kind of don't really follow through on that for the next following years. So I don't know if it's really a feather in his cap or not. I mean, it starts the improvement of relations that is going to be vital going into the Civil War, but I'm not sure it's the most beneficial thing. From what we've got there, what do you think?
I think I'm kind of feeling, I don't know if F is like too strong. I don't know. I feel like with what's like currently like in F right now, maybe it is like a little, I feel like maybe like low D. Do you think that's probably right? Or would you just straight up
Place him below Adams for,
yeah.
Because it's like, if we enter the Civil War in 1850 with the Union, with a war of, the North attacking the South, I don't really see what we're going to do better than in our timeline. We're going to get probably a wider revolt, greater increased chance of European intervention, and a general American public that is not yet as on the abolition trade as they will be in 1860. So I think D is pretty fair.
Okay. All right, then, yeah. D it is.
Okay, sorry, I just had the issue with my mic for a sec. Yeah, I think D's fairly fair. Maybe get bumped down to F later, depending on how things go, but
yeah, I think that's fair. Who is the next?
Oh, do you not realize our main man, Millard Fillmore?
Oh, who could forget?
Famously played by Alec Baldwin in the greatest film that has not yet been made.
Oh, who doesn't love Millard Fillmore? I remember you were actually telling me that Millard Fillmore, like a little while ago, you were telling me that Millard Fillmore is actually more important than I think a lot of people realize.
Okay. Yes, because Millard Fillmore enters office as Zachary Taylor dies. So we have two elected Whig generals who die, and then have a president who basically does the exact opposite of what they're doing, and that is the legacy of Whig presidents. But considering how low we ranked Taylor, that's going to prove better for Fillmore. Now, for Fillmore, what everyone always talks about is the Compromise of 1850, but specifically when they say that, they're really just saying, I want to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. So, as we established with Washington, a slave that escapes into a different state is not made free. That is in the Constitution. That is labeled in the Constitution. It's still there. What the Fugitive Slave Act does is it just basically reinforces that. However, it's not really going to have teeth until the Dred Scott case after his presidency, where Taney is going to rule that you can be tried for aiding, abetting, or even just like not turning in an escaped slave. But that won't occur exactly during his presidency. The remainder of the Compromise of 1850, I think, is actually pretty fair. We see the slave trade ends in DC. we see a clear line of uh of slavery kind of being contained largely. California is fully expedited into the Union as a free state. So there is, or let me remember correctly, California gets expedited, so it's not going to be argued over as long as every other territory, so it can get admitted to the Union without being divided. Let me see what else. And also, he does get Texas to agree to the border alteration that his predecessor was threatening violence over.
Ah.
Beyond, but what I think really is the major difference is between Zachary and Fillmore is we are going from someone who knows nothing about foreign policy to a very effective foreign policy. After Taylor pisses off all of Europe, Fillmore is able to normalize relations with essentially the entire continent very quickly and opening even more trade than previously. He is the president who sends the Perry expedition, which opens Japan. So we now have a link in the Pacific trade.
All right, that's pretty big, yeah.
Napoleon III, who we mentioned earlier, attempts to annex Hawaii during his presidency, and he is able to put a stop to that in incidents that are very well unknown. And he is able to distance the American government from the filibuster attempts, which is going to be very important because specifically during his presidency, several filibusters will be executed in Spanish Cuba, which he is able to calm relations between, because, you know, these people were breaking the law, but they were still American citizens summarily executed by a foreign power. His ability to mediate that crisis and prevent spiking tensions with Spain is rapidly important. It's just, he's also, on another note, he's the first real presidential advocate of a continental railroad. It doesn't really get made during his presidency, but he's kind of the beginning of the journey on that whole front.
All right.
So it's really, I think, in my opinion, a solid presidency. The biggest contentions against that is obviously the Fugitive Slave Act and the arguments of, you know, was he trying to prevent, he was obviously trying to prevent civil war, which fails 10 years down the line. But I think from where he was standing, getting a 10-year compromise that delayed it to the point that it was, because by 1860, the demands of compromise is a amendment permanently enshrining slavery as a legal institution. This is like, I think this was the last compromise that was able to be made without causing war, and he was able to craft it fairly expertly.
All right. I think in that case, I feel like that's all, a lot of it is pretty positive. I feel like, I mean, would it be, I feel like, would it be fair to even put him in like B plus or A?
I'd say B plus.
B plus, would you put him below or higher than Jefferson, do you think?
I think because he still ultimately the Fugitive Slave Act and its consequences, I'm still going to put him below Jefferson. I also think Jefferson just has like that kind of star power in American history that Millard Fillmore lacks. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can't keep up, man.
Like, I'm sorry to admit it, but that's just the truth. It's like, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, B. You think B plus below Jefferson? I think that sounds pretty fair to me.
Okay, and now we are going to get into the undisputable lead up to the Civil War. Franklin Pierce. Biggest accomplishments is Gadsden Purchase from Mexico and the beginning of surveys for the Transcontinental Railroad. The biggest failure is he signs into a law that incentivizes basically the Kansas Territory falling into civil war. And people have argued that the Civil War truly started under his administration due to the open violence. Uh,
Yes, that's a really big moment. I feel like Bleeding
it's
Kansas.
yes, Bleeding Kansas. I think the Civil War historians that I most respect largely label the point of no return on the road to the Civil War being the Lecompton Constitution and the conclusions of Bleeding Kansas. And is your microphone buzzing or is that just my end?
Uh, I don't hear anything, so it might be my microphone buzzing.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, you're good. I think Tyler is a competitor for one of the lowest presidents in American history. Just simply because how pivotal he is in the road to the Civil War.
Yeah, no, I agree. I remember one of those cute little fun facts about Tyler is that people hated him so much that he wasn't even put on the ballot for re-election. They just didn't even bother because he was so unpopular.
Yeah,
But,
that's damn. Okay, and
yeah,
now we
yeah, I
have
think that's
James
fair.
Buchanan.
All right, well,
So you already know my opinion on James Buchanan. It's kind of a a basic opinion. I think at least among people who know history.
yeah, no, I agree.
It's like anytime you see any sort of historian rank, Buchanan is at the bottom. So let's just go over why. Because I think a lot of people just kind of chalk it up to, oh, he doesn't do anything when the Confederacy succeeds.
Hmm.
But it really is that he worsens the situation leading up to that. He is the designer of the concept of popular sovereignty. The idea that, you should just vote for who wants to be a slave state, who wants to be a free state, which leads into the design of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He oversees the Dred Scott case, which rules that, as we talked about, slavery is... You can get arrested for not arresting an escaped slave. And
yeah, that's a big one.
Famously calls it the resolution to the crisis.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, that is fucking terrible. During the debates leading up to Lincoln's placement into power, he endorses the Corwin Amendment, which is the amendment that would enshrine slavery into the U.S. Constitution. He failed to do any action to keep the states from seceding, basically saying he believed it was illegal, unethical, and immoral for them to secede, but that he had no power to do anything about that. In the midst of all of this, he sends an army to Utah to kick out Brigham Young from power. Now, there is, it's going to be controversial where we live to talk about it, but Brigham Young was basically a dictator of the state that it did not separate church and state effectively. The one thing is there was like no debate. From what my reading on the Utah War is essentially that the USA just assumes the Mormons are in open revolt. And because they send an army, then the Mormons go into open revolt. It's just like this really stupid chicken and egg situation. And considering that is like usually placed by some as the highlight of his presidency, is preventing this more dictatorial governor. But he just like it could have been handled so much better.
It doesn't even necessarily work because he just ends up sending what's his name, Brigham Young, just ends up sending them like into the woods, and they all run off and continue doing their thing anyways.
Now, if I do remember correctly, I'm trying to remember. I think the resolution is that like really doesn't change much for the daily life in the Utah Territory. It just ends up when the army does enter Salt Lake, they kind of just meet there and then they talk right there and kind of resolve the crisis. It's just like the most out of nowhere stupid moments in American history, if you ask me. I just like cannot fathom this man.
We stand Buchanan. He's awesome.
So obviously he goes into S+ as our greatest president of all time. Maybe from a Southern perspective, or if you're a fan of the Confederacy, you can rank him as a. I would honestly not even as a fan of the Confederacy. Just like if you're an
I was gonna
open
say
fan
he
of
still would not be
slavery,
that good.
if you're an open fan of slavery, then he is an S plus president. But beyond that perspective, it's like anytime you see any ranking of U.S. presidents where someone is worse than Buchanan or is placed on the same level as Buchanan, it is disingenuous. For a modern president to be ranked lower than Buchanan, they would have to lead a prolonged armed insurrection against the institutions of democracy. That is what our standard is for this man. It is like we talked about for S tier, where we're probably going to have to debate at the end who going in S plus. There is no debate. It is a long gap from him to the second worst.
Oh yeah, people in the chat. Ethan says, "If I was John Tyler, I would end my life."
Yeah, Tyler. I mean, the issue would be then who would be president after that, because John Tyler never appointed a vice president.
All right. Well, I guess the next one I feel like is going to be pretty uncontroversial, at least similarly.
Okay, yeah, Lincoln's S tier. It's not really debatable. The best way to describe Lincoln is the man who united the nation. And I don't mean that in just some sort of, he kept the South in. Like, for one, he kept the South in. The Civil War sees the development of an American, national identity over state identity. And the early Republican Party is largely responsible for the settlement of the West. Because he's the one to approve the Continental Railroad. We get the Homestead Act, which sees the vast settlement of the West and the creation of the Department of Agriculture. He also is the first president to implement a income tax, and yes, it was tiered and progressive. So, very ahead of his time in a lot of regards. His leadership in the Civil War is pivotal. Do you have any other praises you want to sing to Abraham Lincoln before I get into what's limiting him from being the S plus tier president?
Well, no, I feel like you've already pretty much said it. I mean, he is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. That's a pretty big one, I feel like.
Yeah, it's very. You're right. That outweighs everything else. But so
no, not continue.
So for limiting factors on the Lincoln presidency is I think he's fairly poor in his military command, his actual leadership as a commander-in-chief. We see several years of fighting in Virginia over a very small territory with basically a rotating cabinet of generals. It should not take until 1865 to do it. I have seen some argument that McClellan's plan to take Richmond, if given more resources, could have succeeded. And considering how strange that campaign was on the Confederate side, I kind of side with that opinion, but Lincoln would wholly abandon the idea afterward. The basic concept was you land on a peninsula south of Richmond and march north. Lincoln really did not like the idea because he wanted to always, at any given moment, have at least a army matching Lee in strength between Lee and D.C. That wasn't really necessary because the D.C. garrison was so well dug in and so large. And he kind of just abandons that idea as soon as Grant comes over and asks him to send him the entire D.C. garrison. And Grant ultimately does defeat the Confederates in Virginia by marching south of Richmond and sieging Petersburg. So Lincoln very limited that campaign. If his Reconstruction policy went into effect, it would have been far too lax. It was basically 10% of a state needed to swear loyalty, and then you're a state again. We don't know what he would have done or would have changed from that, but I think Lincoln got lucky when he got shot because he was at the high tide of anything he was going to do.
Yeah.
And lastly is, now that we're getting through the Civil War, we have to start contending with the fact that the Gilded Age is oncoming. and the tariffs Lincoln imposes, they're basically designed. The idea is fairly intelligent. If we put a very high tax on anything that can be produced in America that's being imported, and then drop taxes on any raw resources, it will stimulate American industry. And that works for the time. It works so well, in fact, we start seeing the growth of these robber barons and mega corporations. And Lincoln is in part responsible for that. There is a reason the Republicans, even today, are the party of big business, and Lincoln is not exempt from that trend.
That's actually really interesting. I don't think I've ever actually heard that connection before.
Yeah. So he is like probably there's other people much more responsible, but we are going to see the beginning of that with Lincoln.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I mean, I feel like it's we can we'll have our discussion about who's going to be like an S+ later, I think. For now, I would put him above George probably. I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say.
Okay, we'll place him above George, just kind of tentatively. We now get to the first president to face an impeachment trial. Not the first one to have impeachment drafted against him. That would be, well, technically Jefferson, but it was like one dude and only he voted for it. It would be Tyler, who is the first person to have an impeachment drafted against him seriously. But this is the first president to face an impeachment trial. What to say about Andrew Johnson is the man bought Alaska.
Oh, that is true. That is true.
That is true.
That is very important.
But he largely failed on Reconstruction.
I think my hot take is probably would you say buying Alaska would keep him out of See Me After Class, or do you think he's just...
That'd be very close. That'd be because what you got to think is, okay, it's hard to kind of put into words, but Andrew Johnson, I think part of the reason he failed on Reconstruction was a personal power trip as well.
Oh yeah.
So, because do you know kind of like what this man's origins are? I don't know specifically. I know he was a really big fan of Andrew Jackson. That's about, I think, the most I know from his personal life. Okay, yeah. So that was his saving grace. That's why he's on the ticket. Is he was the only Southern Democrat from a senator from a state that seceded to remain in the Union. He was put on the ticket as a symbol of national unity. But he was a fairly poor Southerner. So when he ends up getting power, the policy for Reconstruction that is implemented is that anyone who is lower ranking is given a blanket pardon, but higher ranking officials and large plantation owners, the people who started the war effectively and fought it explicitly over slavery, require individual pardons, and he will grant pretty much every single one so long as they come and grovel and beg before him.
Okay.
To me, that's, at least I will be fair, that is my opinion gained from the Ron Chernow Grant biography, which has a bent towards favoring Grant and opposing his opponents. But still, I think the fact he kind of just let everyone off the hook, we're going to see essentially a reemergence of slavery in the form of these malicious contracts.
Yeah.
Towards the freed slaves. He completely abandons economic recompensation to slaves. It's like he is probably, like I said, Lincoln's Reconstruction would probably fail, but what he did was, I think, measurably worse than what Lincoln wanted to do.
Absolutely, 100%.
So I think right now he is I would put him top of See Me After Class. He has
All
the
right.
potential to get bumped up to F, depending on where we go with other presidents. And now we have Ulysses S. Grant.
Hmm.
So,
All right. What are you thinking? What are you thinking?
so I think Grant's a very controversial figure, especially today. Just kind of how a vitriolic discussion of the Civil War has become. I think he was a better general than he was president.
Agreed.
I'm not going to really get into some of his moral failures as general. We can talk about those, but he mostly makes up for them in his presidency. Uh, I think really what lies with Grant is this thing that affects a lot of the general presidents. I think it's kind of clear with Taylor in the way he acted. We're not going to see it too much moving forward. Eisenhower's going to be able to avoid it, but this movement from military to political command, where you're going from I issue an order and it is followed to the letter to I issue an order and everyone wants something in return and I don't understand this place. So,
What do you think are his biggest? What do you think are his biggest shortcomings as president? Do you think?
so his biggest like shortcomings, he's strange because there's like a shortcoming, a mistake, and a thing of malice that he commits to each of them. So, as a shortcoming, he he really is unable to sniff out the corruption under his own nose, which leads to the expansion of the Gilded Age
Hmm.
to the degree we're going to see it, where robber barons can get away with just insane shit, terrible working conditions as industrialization continues. Um, for failures, we're going to start seeing the continual economic panics that are going to be plaguing the country starting at near the end of his administration, and we are going to see, in terms of like a terrible failure, we're going to see the Black Hills incident and the Sioux War. So there is a treaty with the Sioux to basically granting them the Black Hills at this point. It's the place where Mount Rushmore is built.
Hmm.
Gold is discovered there, and Grant immediately revokes the treaty and like personally plans the military campaign against them. That's where the famous Custer's last stand
Yeah.
and Battle of Little Bighorn occurs. It is like there are, America has like a lot of sins with it's like its history to the Native Americans, but Grant kind of just destroys it. He is that is one of the probably the most abhorrent cases outside of the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
In terms of like wins though, he is able to crush the first KKK. He is able to do an effective reconstruction that will leave some semblance of normal. There's kind of, I think when we teach history, it's oversimplified that as soon as Grant leaves office and Reconstruction ends, that everything goes to Jim Crow. There's kind of a period leading up to that, which is fairly more stable. So he does get some credit for that in my book, and at least at the bare minimum, having the effective Reconstruction during his own presidency. And he normalizes relations with Britain following the Civil War, because there was debate in Britain over siding with the Confederacy, and there were British ships produced in British ports used by the Confederacy. He is able to basically get Britain to pay back all damages caused by those ships in a treaty. After that, I think like this is after Grant, there's not going to be like any direct conflict with Britain between the U.S. and England. It's like it is gone now, and we begin to see. We start on the long road to the transatlantic alliance.
That's pretty big. I think with all that, I don't know if I don't think it feels right putting him in D tier. I think C is maybe fair.
Yeah,
Maybe
I'll say to C. We still have plenty of time for people to get bumped up or down.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe even just for the sake of balance, I think it just works out. Just like looking at who's in each tier right now, I think it just makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. We are now going to pull out a Rutherford B. Hayes.
Rutherford,
So
famous for being more impactful outside the states than in them.
yes, so we have Paraguay. What is it? Paraguay. Yeah, he saves a country in Latin America.
Mm.
So with Hayes' presidency, we are now fully in the Gilded Age. It is, in his first year of presidency, he uses federal troops to end a strike against a private company on the behest of the company. I think that is the clearest marker of the era we are entering, where basically companies will be able to utilize government power to injure workers and the working class. He abandons Reconstruction very quickly. That's part of the deal
Yeah.
of it. I think the Grant biography I read, I think it makes an interesting case for the necessity of that. Hayes is, I think, the second president on our list where you could argue he was not elected legitimately. And I think he has the most clear argument for that case because Tilden wins the popular vote. He wins the electoral vote very narrowly, and only because Grant is able to essentially establish military protections of certain voting booths in certain southern states, which, was to protect blacks' rights to vote, but does raise the question of electioneering in several instances.
Yeah.
So basically, in a deal, it is he will get the presidency to end Reconstruction, and we are only 12 years off the Civil War, and we have a South that is being militarily occupied. There are shouts in the street declaring Tilden or war, or Tilden or blood as well, being like, give us the person, not Hayes, the other candidate, or there will be open rebellion. And the excerpt that I kind of remember from the biography of Grant that I very much like. It's the same guy who did the Hamilton biography that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda. Get me my Grant musical, goddammit. Is basically the choice wasn't just a second civil war, is they were now looking up at a civil war with Gatling guns, repeater rifles, where both sides would have the legitimacy to carry the American flag. It would have been a modern style, like Syrian civil war in the United States without clear lines, because we had Southerners like James Longstreet siding with Grant, where we have the Democratic Party, period, siding with Tilden, including a large portion of New York and General Sherman, Grant's protege. So it's like, I don't really knock him as much for ending Reconstruction just because of what the alternative at that moment was. And if Tilden had won, it would have been the exact same deal. And like what I previously mentioned, there is a kind of a period where we're not yet into Jim Crow. There is still racism in the South, obviously, and there's still economic inequality enforced by laws and social pressure, but we are not yet into Jim Crow. We'll talk about that when we get there.
Yeah. Do you
after you?
I was gonna say I think C would probably make sense for me.
C, yeah. I will also add one thing I forgot to mention is the economic crisis that begins with Grant does worsen under his presidency, which is partially why he's putting down strikes with soldiers. So that might lower him to
below. Okay.
Oh, he might get bumped up though, just kind of by force. Would you be good to take a quick flight? I got to take a piss.
Yeah, go ahead.
And you can talk about our next candidate and the orange cat named after him.
All right, James Garfield. I actually do have stuff to say about James Garfield. So James Garfield, he is shot. Uh, he's shot by Charles Guiteau, famously. He died. He was a big advocate for education reform. I think if, from what I understand, I feel like if Garfield was uh, allowed to continue being president, I feel like we probably would have seen a lot more in the way. uh, yeah, he also really hated Mondays. And there's also a county in Utah named after James Garfield. Fun fact. I feel like we probably would have seen maybe development of the maybe development of education in the United States go up a little bit faster. Uh, Although he didn't really get a chance to do much. I think he's, as far as I understand, he's pretty recognized as a positive force. He didn't really get a chance to do anything negative. Although I don't know, maybe uh, if he had a chance, it might be a case where maybe he just died before he had a chance to do something. Uh, I'm a pretty big advocate for James Garfield. I think I don't think I've seen Hacksaw Ridge, but I fuck you. I was like, I think that movie is set like a million years after this happened, but I just got it. All right. I was just saying that I feel like unless there's something I don't know, I'm a pretty big advocate for James Garfield. As far as I understand, he was a big advocate for education reform. He got shot before he really had a chance to do much, but I don't really think he did anything negative. As far as I know, he was. Oh shit, my bad. As far as I know,
Yeah.
he didn't have anything that was gonna have that like especially negative that would have happened if he died. But you might have like a bomb that I just don't know.
Okay, well, my one thing is that it's like, if he had lived, he probably would have been forced into the same position as vice president was and had to sign the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Okay, that's
But
valid.
that's kind of happened no matter what was going to happen there. Um, no, but he was I think his program was fairly effective. He was also the kind of last stand against the Gilded Age in a fair few people's eyes. He was fairly progressive for his time, and he was the first president to really push for civil service reform. And his death by Charles Guiteau, a random dude who gave one speech without any coordination to the campaign and then shot him because he wasn't given an ambassadorship, really forwarded that cause. The only issue with that as well is like, from everything I see, is like Charles Guiteau was probably going to shoot whoever became president.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the man flip flops very heavily, and there is a great portion where Grant was considering a third term, following Hayes's brief presidency. So Guiteau was stalking Grant. And as soon as Grant lost the nomination, he stopped stalking Grant. It's just like, whoever was elected in that year was going to be shot by Charles Guiteau. And then he gave the man was just clinically insane. He picked the firearm that he thought would look best in a museum for the assassination.
Andrew Garfield, if he was, did I just call him Andrew Garfield? James Garfield. If he was, he probably would have been fine if they didn't dig the bullet out of him with the unsanitized tools.
Yeah, it was the infection that killed him, but anyone was gonna die of infection. It's just very funny You know, it's just like one of these strangest situations in American history. And he's like, Guiteau goes on and like he's going to be executed, and he gives like the shittiest speech in American history. It's not even a speech; it's like this really terrible poem where he like it's called "Oh Lordy, My Lordy," and it's like it just pronounced. It's like a line that makes no sense about how he saved the nation,
And he
followed
does
by
it.
"Oh Lordy, I'm going to the Lordy" every time. Like the man, it's like I think it's like James Garfield should be a symbol for like the necessity of mental health evaluations before purchasing a firearm. Beyond that, I think really it's like I can't really think of too much negative, but that's because he died so early in his
Yeah,
presidency.
he didn't really get much of a chance. He probably. You're right with the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think if he was given the chance, or if he was allowed, he probably would be looked on maybe like a little bit more negatively. But I would probably put him into B or B plus. I think I like Garfield.
Yeah, I want to lean towards B plus. Just I think people never rank him, and I think he deserves some credit.
Yeah, a
And
little bit.
I gotta disagree with Captain Sham down here. In most of his campaign appearances, Garfield probably could have been removed, and honestly, they would have been made better. You know, I don't know. Just Garfield without Garfield's a pretty funny sub when it works.
uh, then next is Chester A. Arthur, that guy. Uh, all I know about him is the Chinese Exclusionary Act.
Yeah, so that was the issue in judging him on that is that was like something that Congress was going to pass no matter what he did, and he did put some opposition to it, but ultimately he relented. Um, he did fulfill Garfield's promise on civil service reform. I don't think he was holistic as Garfield would have been. And the one major change is while Garfield was promising more spending, Arthur really sat back on the Treasury, kind of allowed it to be local developments. And I think, and we got to remember throughout all this era, the government's largely loaning out to mostly corporations for infrastructure. I mean,
Mhm.
that's how it's usually done. But now these corporations are getting larger and are gaining more control of the economy. And he's kind of sitting on federal money. It's like I think he's kind of just a placeholder president, in my real opinion. Is anything he did was going to be done by Garfield, and he's more defined by doing not too much, from
Yeah.
what I gather. I'm not very clear on his presidency, so that just can be a illustration of my lack of knowledge. But I don't
Uh,
really feel much from him.
I feel like Chester. I feel like I think honestly, he's probably the most notable for not being like notable at all. He's probably the
Yeah.
one most people forget about. So I
Well,
think
no,
I
that
think
that will be in two spots. Uh, so because Benjamin Harrison is the most forgotten American president, and it is kind of funny.
uh so I guess B is probably fine then, but if he didn't really do that much, but I
Uh,
feel,
I
or
kind of
do you
want to.
think?
I lean C because I think we've been giving people B's for like accomplishing things.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. That's fair. If he's, yeah, I feel like C is probably like a good like true neutral here.
Okay, so and now we are getting to Cleveland's first term. Now, a lot of conservatives really like Cleveland for his laissez-faire economics and is very limiting of presidential power. Basically, if he did not believe something was within the constitutional authority of the president, he would not do it, which is respectable. But it also leads to a few situations where he probably could have uh, done more and openly vetoed it. The ones that are most notable is expansion for Civil War pensions and agricultural relief to a failed crop in Texas. He does nothing about either of those because he believes they're not in the power of the presidency. He personally rejects the spoil system. He keeps a fair number of Republicans within his administration. So he's if you're looking for kind of like if you're looking for the ideal conservative of like a modern day of where he would just like come in, change very little, and just kind of let things run, then you would probably really like him. His one major failure, one thing he's hit on morally, is the Dawes Act, where he's going to sell off native land,
Yeah,
which
that's a big
is
one.
so. I think the thing is we did see economic growth during his presidency. I see why people like him, especially in this term. So I'm willing to like put him fairly decently high, like obviously not A or B plus, but
All right.
he's an okay president for his first term.
Would you say he is above or below Monroe?
Monroe's over here in A tier. You mean Madison?
Yeah, sorry, Madison. My bad, my bad.
I mean, Madison, like we did put down because of his like the War of 1812. So yeah, maybe above Madison
All right. All right, I think that's fair
because
then.
it's a fairly like mild presidency, and not just mild in the way Arthur was, where it was just like, oh, just kind of do nothing. It was like we're seeing economic growth, so don't question it. Was
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of the mode of the day, and he did have like his principles, which he stuck to, so that is respectable. We're going to. I think I was kind of surprised by how busy the presidency of Benjamin Harrison was.
I I know Benjamin Harrison because of the Wounded Knee Massacre. That's his thing.
Yes, so he is going to have quite a lot of violence during his administration. So he is probably the last candidate before the modern era that is going to make a mode out of civil rights, out of voter protection for African Americans. And he fails horribly. The Lodge Bill, which would have given federal oversight to elections, completely collapses and acts, and basically its rejection leads to a increase in voter discrimination in the South. We're going to see the Homestead Strike, which is one of the most famous, well, fairly small scale, famous strikes in American history for the amount of bloodshed that occurs during it.
Hmm.
Um, and as you mentioned, the Ghost Dance, Wounded Knee. So the Ghost Dance is basically a Native American movement, from what I gather. I haven't done too much. It's basically a spiritualist movement that believed that a return to some native traditional values would lead to a return of the pre-United States status quo. So that is technically saying like this will make the white people disappear, which is alarming to many Americans. But rather than seeing it as kind of the strange religious movement that it was, it is perceived as a attempt, or at least the organization for violent insurrection, and so is brutally put down
Yeah.
unnecessarily. Um, then we have the two Sherman Acts, one very negative and one very positive. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act is going to lead to a run on the banks. So at the time, as we talked about briefly with Lincoln, there was debates over how to run the economy. So after the Civil War, paper money became less accepted as people saw it as a wartime measure. So the debate became over: should we use silver as well as gold to mint coins, or as a basis of currency as well? That would allow the similar, farmers can have more freedom with their economics. There would be more money in the system, so it'd be easier for people to start small businesses or get small loans. He kind of does a half measure with this act where silver is accepted but not a trade standard, which leads to a collapse in the value of the dollar and a run on the banks, leading to the Panic of 1893, um, also called the Great Depression, because the regular Great Depression has not happened yet, and is the worst. Or was that 1873? There's like too many. Every few years in the Gilded Age there is an economic crisis, which just owes to the fact of how unstable corporate rule is. Now, the positives.
Let's just say, what is the positive?
So the second Sherman Act is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which makes it does legitimize some monopolies, but it is going to be the first stepping stone into trust busting. So essentially what it does is it gives the federal government the authority to break up a company if we can prove something illegal happened in the creation or maintenance of a monopoly. This is cited to this day. This is a ongoing function in American politics, and it occurred through the stewardship of Benjamin Harrison. He wasn't necessarily the founder of the bill, but his administration, kind of his benefit. He is going to see the creation of the forest reserves, which are going to be the precursors to national parks and the national forest. So some of the first protections of the environment are going to occur under his administration. And he is going to see the admission of more states than any other single president, with 6 states added to the Union and Utah put on deck.
All right.
So those are some fairly substantial accomplishments, but not really that kind of outweighed by his failures.
I was going to say, I think it's a pretty rough rep sheet.
Yeah, I do want to give him some credit because I think he is so forgotten, often what we remember is just the bad things when we do bother looking into him. But he is this kind of like strange figure where he is halfway in the Gilded Age, but he is kind of pivotal to the setup of the Progressive Era.
I think. All right. Well, I mean,
someone's saying B. I'm not necessarily sure about B.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit lower, probably. But do you think? Because going in, I didn't know about setting up the Progressive Era. I didn't know about it. I only really knew about his negatives. So when I was doing my precursor tier list, I had just put him straight into F, honestly. Do you think, what are you feeling right now?
I mean, it's kind of hard to rank him because he is like great positives and massive negatives. So maybe if we put him in C and see where we kind of bump him down from there.
Yeah, depending on.
I feel like what we're probably going to end up is we're probably going to have like a bumping trigger down from the top at some point.
Yeah.
And then we'll reassess things when we get to there. Okay, and now we have where I said Cleveland was a very respectable president with morals. I think the second Cleveland administration is an F-tier presidency.
And why is that?
So he does repeal the Sherman-Silver Act, which is able to stabilize. It stops the run on the banks, but the economy does not stabilize because, as we see even in like modern economics, the cause of most economic crises is not the actual cause; it's the spark that sets off the chain reaction. He isn't really able to resolve anything in that, and it is going to torch the rest of his administration. Because of this economic collapse, we are going to see the Pullman strike, which is one of the largest strikes in U.S. history. Basically, national rail workers all across the country go on strike, and this brings the economy to its knees. And he sends in the army rather than negotiate. We are going to start seeing the beginning of what is called the nadir, which is the point where Jim Crow actually starts emerging in the South. We saw it a little bit with Benjamin with the failure of the Lodge Bill, which starts seeing people like beginning to implement more these acts. He repeals the Enforcement Act, which was the act signed by Grant that allowed the government the abilities to go after domestic terrorist groups. Basically, he is the reason that when the second KKK comes up, the government isn't really able to do anything about it. The repeal of that act leads directly to that fall. It doesn't emerge during his presidency, but the repeal of the Enforcement Act is a throwing the bone to the South that will eventually allow the rise of the second KKK. And then finally, in foreign policy, my final placement of like things, he accepts the Bayonet Constitution for Hawaii, which is where the American business owners in Hawaii rise up, overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii, and force them to sign a pro-American constitution at bayonet point. Yikes. He initially opposes it, but he ultimately does sign it with pressure from Congress. So there is, like, I really see very little benefits except arguably the repeal of the Silver Act, which, you know, is debatable depending on your position on silver, which is a hot topic at the time. I mean, in the Wizard of Oz, there was a reason the yellow brick road led to the fake land of Oz, and the silver shoes, which were changed to ruby in the movie, were what eventually led her home. It's the Wizard of Oz is political, which fucking is amazing. Anytime anyone like talks about how we politicize things too much, remember the Wizard of Oz was like a piece of propaganda for a very specific fringe movement. It's like, what does Dorothy the lion, what literally the entire like main cast just symbolizes different people that they want to get in the coalition. The Tin Man's supposed to be the industrial workers, the Scarecrow's supposed to be the agricultural workers, the Lion's supposed to be like the people too cowardly to stand up to the corporations, and Dorothy is like the embodiment of America or some bullshit like that. I'm not pulling this out of my ass. Like, the author said this.
No. And the witch is the witch is like big business. I remember actually I've read about this before. The road is specifically supposed to represent the gold standard, and the witch keeps trying to like knock them off of it. And that's like her thing.
Yeah.
And interestingly, though, the fact that it's the witch is not really, or the only like non like political part about it is the fact that it features female characters, and he received a little bit of like a backlash, and he was like, I just think female characters are cool.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. That was an interesting kind of a thing during this time. Is, you know, suffrage is going to start coming up eventually.
Yeah.
Which leads to Wyoming being the first state to have women's suffrage. Like, they refuse to enter the Union until their women are allowed to vote. Which leads to the hilarious situation where now one of the most conservative states in the nation's state motto is equal rights. It's like this really weird. It's just like, I saw that, I'm just like, that does not match at all.
So, what is keeping him out of See Me After Class for you? Is it just the fact that we have so many down there right now?
I think because we did say we were going to limit that 1 to 3.
All right, that's fair.
So, like, what is he? Because causes the Civil War, destroys his own political party, and just fails in Reconstruction. I think Cleveland is the bottom of F tier, his second term.
Okay. I think that I agree with that. That's sentiment.
Now we are into the end, near the end of the Gilded Age with William McKinley. So I think the single most pivotal portion of his presidency. Okay, well, there's two really true things. Is one, he is the kind of embodiment of the Gilded Age in a way. He directly runs against William Jennings Bryan multiple times. Bryan is the progressive candidate from out west who is trying to reform the whole system. McKinley is basically the first modern corporate campaign. He has the elections. he ran in were some of the most expensive in American history, adjusted for inflation. Um, he is probably the president most single-handedly responsible for the creation of the American empire, because we are going to see the Spanish-American War during his administration. We're going to see the annexation of Hawaii. We're going to see the
Mhm.
occupation of the Philippines, the Philippine War. Basically, the only time he doesn't like take an opportunity to get territory is with Cuba itself, due to the controversy it would cause at home. He is fairly torn up by a lot of this in like his own writings, but he kind of takes the white man burden stance of it's like, oh, it is my moral Christian responsibility given by God to civilize the universe, and it does not read well these days. Um, I think he's a fairly poor president. He does resolve some issues of the era. The Gold Standard Act lays the gold and silver issue to rest in a fairly decent enough way. He does increase tariffs towards corporate interests. And one of the most damning portions, and this is where I think we really enter the Jim Crow era, is he cares very little at all about civil rights whatsoever. And during his administration, we will see the Wilmington coup, which is where a fairly large town in North Carolina, which still at this point has black representatives and black people in power, will see a coup to establish a white government and a whites only government.
Mm.
He does nothing. He states he is aware of it. He states he can do nothing without the request of the governor of North Carolina. So
I
we see
w-
kind of beginning across the South the sweeping, realization of, hey, now we can fully subjugate the African American population. Um, so really, his positives come down to your opinion on, America becoming a global power.
yeah, I will say, I think one of the biggest points of conflict for me personally, I think the annexation of Hawaii is uh is a incredibly violent. It's probably one of the like I think it's the single one of the worst single things that happens with this guy's presidency. Uh, although I think uh in retrospect maybe I'm not saying it's like it was the right thing to do morally, but I think Hawaii was going to get annexed eventually, probably anyways. So, and it is a really I think it is a pretty integral part of the modern United States, and also during the World War II, especially. Uh, I think Hawaii I think is his biggest thing for me, and it's like my biggest point of contention.
The Philippines will come along with that as well. And I think, in a way, kind of American control over Polynesia, I kind of equate in my mind to British Ireland, where it's like they are a second class, they are oppressed, but they disproportionately serve and are welcoming to the United States. Like, I mean, in like modern military service is disproportionately Polynesian,
Mm,
and in kind of culture and projection abroad, they do punch above their weight. Being a much smaller portion of the population than Ireland, you don't see it as much, but I think it is present. I mean, we do have, in fact, a president from Hawaii. You know,
that's true. It's true.
so it's like it is one of the most abhorrent grabs that gave us this state. But when we really get down to it, a lot of America was built off of that. It's just he did it particularly worse.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, what are you feeling right now? What do you think?
I mean, I'm not really sure. I kind of want to place him in D tier, just because I'm not a big fan of corporate presidents,
I agree.
and he really embodies that. I don't think he's better than Taylor, for sure.
What about Adams? Do you think?
I mean, here's the kind of question: is like Adams and these are the two presidents right here that I think if they had stayed in office longer, had the possibility of causing a completely separate civil war. Is my personal hot take, but I know those are very thin evidence and hot takes, just because Adams was so controversial in his time, and I think if you don't get McKinley's second VP entering into office, you're probably going to never see the progressive issues resolved, leading to socialist agitation.
I guess also an important part of McKinley, he dies, right? Where he gets shot. He's assassinated.
He gets shot by a random anarchist.
Yeah.
So
and that leads into I think one of the better, I think debatably better presidents.
I think, yeah, Theodore Roosevelt is what he ushers in the progressive era. He is one of the most pivotal figures in American history. That he is one of the very few presidents known outside of like the founding fathers and Lincoln, I think speaks volumes. Just to go over some of his stuff, because I could not talk about all of it. Began the progressive era with the Square Deal. There were strikes early in his presidency, which he was able to mediate rather than put down violently. Vast investigations into corruption, Clean Drug and Food Acts, liberal use of the Sherman Antitrust Acts, creation of national parks, creation of the Panama Canal. It's like when you think like there's a reason this man is our character in Civ 6. He is the American president. The most American man to ever live. Other things that like might be less known, he mediated the Russo-Japanese War, which hilariously gets this man a Peace Prize. Roosevelt was given a what's it called? It's not Pulitzer. Why am I thinking Pulitzer?
Nobel.
Yeah, the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded to Roosevelt for mediating the Russo-Japanese War. He also mediates the Moroccan crisis between the French and the Germans. He is able to he establishes the Roosevelt Corollary, which is going to see the U.S. intervene more internationally, but not necessarily on moralistic or corporate grounds, but more so to, I think, is probably the one of the more clean foreign policies. Not necessarily in that it's like, oh my god, everything it does is moral, but just kind of an admittance that we are going to like do the least amount of violence possible to get what we want, but then we are willing to, show of force, but in a very limited way as much as possible. They speak calmly and carry a big stick, and he implements that fairly well in a crisis in Venezuela where several European countries are trying to blockade the nation due to its heavy debts towards Europe that it's failing to repay.
Mm-hmm.
He's able to basically talk down a war at that moment, which is effective foreign policy. That being said, he is not a perfect president, obviously. We can get into that, or do you have anything else you would like to add to the praises of Roosevelt before we get into his negatives?
No, I think you've said everything I was going to say.
Okay, so dampening factors, he is kind of partial to some monopolies. He will end up getting bailed out by JP Morgan during a financial crisis in 1907. Basically, his thought was he would go after a monopoly if he believed that monopoly was hurting the American people. So it is kind of like a favoritism going on his personal opinion with that. There is the war in the Philippines is going to continue at a fairly high intensity during his presidency, which was started by McKinley.
Mm.
And I think the single worst kind of like individual action you can lay it's like this is purely Roosevelt's fault was the Brownsville affair, where
Yeah.
I'm assuming you've heard of Brownsville affair because that's
Yeah.
famously the worst part of his presidency. For anyone not aware, that's essentially a town in southern Texas blamed a African American army garrison for a series of robberies and murders and whatnot, and Roosevelt punished them unilaterally without proper trial. It was not a good look and added to the racial tensions of the time. That said, he was one of the first presidents since the Civil War to host a African American in the White House with Booker T. Washington, which was quite controversial at the time. And part of his heavy-handedness on the Brownsville affair was him trying to balance the South's anger at that action. I think we're probably both in agreement. He's one of
I think
S tier.
I think right now, as of right now, I don't know if it is really going to change, but he's probably, I think, the strongest candidate for S plus. I think also another important thing to note about Teddy, did not have a great attitude towards Native Americans.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of, I feel like it's glossed over a little bit. Said some pretty bad stuff and did not really, I don't know if he really like did anything specifically to damage relations with Native Americans, but he was not like crazy about them. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I don't think so. He is, I mean, just finishing out like we started, the most American president, one of the most pivotal figures in American politics. I do genuinely think if Roosevelt was not able to gain the office, we likely wouldn't have seen the progressive era at all, and it likely would have led to the USA slowly declining in the early 1900s. He is one of the most pivotal, and I didn't even mention his naval reforms. He's partially the reason why we were able to project ourselves as a power going into World War I.
Oh yeah, that's very important.
Yeah. Now we get to his protege, Taft.
My man, William Howard Taft. There he is.
You are a Taft fan?
Oh, I'm a big Tafty.
Okay, so what are your takes on Taft?
All right, my takes on Taft. He is he's the trust busting guy, right?
Yeah, he does more trust busting than Roosevelt.
Yeah. He is I'm trying to think of like all the fun facts that I know off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure he was a big advocate for suffrage, women's suffrage. He is the first president to drive a car. I do remember that. I know he's a big deal in the Philippines.
Oh yes, he's the one who ends the
Philippines,
kind of like the hot phase of the Philippine-American War. It won't really be resolved until FDR, but
yeah. All right, I think that's everything I know off the top of my head.
Yeah, he's a pretty good president. I think what he's kind of forgotten about is he did have a very independent foreign policy from Roosevelt. He was the first president to really kind of have the idea of like, let's pursue American business interests in our actions abroad. So the beginning of kind of like the banana republics and wars in Central America is kind of on him. He starts occupying portions of Nicaragua to this end. But this does also lead to a modernization of the whole State Department, where we're actually getting like training. It's like it becomes professional under Taft's He did kind of end up splitting the Republican Party with his tariff policies, which again was like to favor business. He's very strange in that he's smashing monopolies, but working to aid American business interests.
Mm.
Uh, he the only other real negative I have on him is he did kind of pull back from the Teddy's willingness to talk with civil rights leaders for the African American community, which I
Oh
know
yeah,
is
yeah.
kind of
That's a big one.
canceled out by the Brownsville affair, but he does pull back from that, which will lead into the Wilson administration kind of getting to do whatever it wants. But he will be an early advocate for equality of Catholics as well as women. So it's really he kind of forwards everything, but is a step back in African American affairs.
I think it would be fair to put him at like high B plus maybe, or I don't know. What do you think?
I'd say I'd put him below Jefferson.
Below Jefferson? I think that makes sense to me.
Okay, and now a non-controversial decision at all.
This was all right. Yes, Woodrow next, right?
Yes, so people have spent plenty of time debating over whether Wilson was a good person, good president, bad president. There's hour-long videos on this man, and I don't mean in like the section of YouTube that usually makes hour-long videos. I mean in just like the people have gotten vitriolic about him. I won't lie; those are people who have also, been influences on my early studies and entrance into interest in history. So I'm kind of biased toward them. I do see the benefits of the Wilson administration, though. We do kind of see the culmination and completion of the progressive era. We see the Federal Trade Commission, which is going to regulate monopolies even to the modern day. We're going to see the final progressive amendments, women's rights, income tax, stuff of the like. But we're also going to see the Wilsonian foreign policy, where we're starting to intervening nations to try and prop up democracy. So we're going to invade Mexico. We're going to occupy Haiti for nearly 20 years. We're going to intervene in Russia during the Civil War. I also think he kind of stepped off the bounds of what a president should be doing. He decides to go to Versailles on his own to represent America, which leads to kind of a vacuum of what is going on in Washington near the end of his presidency, which is not made better by the fact that in late 1919, he suffers a debilitating stroke that basically makes him incapable of governance during the last year of his presidency, which is not good because that period is going to be known as Red Summer and is one of the most violent and openly chaotic periods in American history. Everyone remembers 2020, right? 2020 was close enough. Bump everything up to 11, and that's what the end of the Wilson administration was. You had open violence between returning African American soldiers and a revitalized KKK in the South.
Mm-hmm.
You had the Spanish influenza spreading like wildfire throughout the country. There were like local ordinances to deal with it, but I'm not really aware of any national program to stop it, and it was kind of suppressed due to war. And the beginning of the first Red Scare, which is going to see the imprisonment of Eugene Debs and several other prominent socialist leaders and agitators, are quite honestly unconstitutionally. And it is honestly that kind of collapse at the end of his administration that is going to see the end of the progressive era as we start getting into the 20s.
So, I just want to know, like, what are you feeling right now in terms of the tier list?
I don't know. I would definitely. I'm not sure about F, but I think maybe D tier, maybe low D tier.
I was I was pretty intent on just putting him. He was in my bottom 5, I think, when I was doing my practice list.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
could see an argument for him being worse than Jackson.
how
Yeah,
many did
I'm
we
right.
say were allowed in D again?
So D through B plus are going to be 7 each. I don't know if we're gonna really. We might. I think we're probably gonna start seeing some bumping soon because we're gonna get into the
Yeah, I
Hoover and
agree.
then the post-war presidencies, are where we're gonna probably start seeing our bumping.
Yeah, and there's a couple stinkers down there that I think are not gonna make it. So I think
I mean, I can see Wilson as low F because really what F means isn't necessarily just like, oh, these are obviously the worst people in this order. And it means like this is a contender for bottom 5.
yeah,
It's like you can't like an S tier means an A tier means the same. Is like I can see someone placing anyone in A tier as like their 5th favorite president without like calling them a hack.
yeah. uh, I'll I think Wilson. I would probably. Hmm, I would probably put him below. I would probably put him below Jackson, I think.
Yeah, I think
But
that's
I'm not
fair.
familiar enough to know. I'm not really familiar enough with Cleveland, other than what you've already said, to say uh what where his position relative to him should be. So if you think he should be lower, then I think that's fine.
I think we'll put him above Cleveland because I'll be honest, I do not know too much about the Gilded Age, so this is kind of like a very rough shot. But from everything I saw of Cleveland's second administration, I didn't really see many redeeming qualities.
I think that's valid.
Um, that brings us into we're going to start moving into the Roaring Twenties now with Harding. So Harding is
Uh,
a very popular president while he's alive, but as soon as he dies, everyone realizes how corrupt he was.
yeah,
Um, so he does campaign on return to normalcy. He is trying to. I think that's kind of keying in off of like how bad the end of Wilson was. Is that people just wanted to return to normal and they did not care. Um, he was very skeptical to organized labor. He would collude with business owners, especially in the Teapot Dome scandal, where he would basically give his friends access to oil on protected land. He abandoned a lot of firm attempts on civil rights and limited immigration. He did try to push for an anti-lynching bill, which failed, which I think kind of probably fell into in his mind that return to normalcy, seeing the increase of racial violence in the South, but ultimately it got rejected. He does release Debs, but he does not do so until the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles, which many people do not realize was in 1921. There was 2 years of debates until the final peace with Germany was signed. There was a state of armistice going on that whole time. Um, he does reconcile Colombia after Panama because we did aid in a revolution against them, so we could build a canal.
yeah,
And he does kind of set the establishment for the economy of the 20s, which will eventually collapse. But there's this kind of misconception, especially regarding Europe, of the 20s as this like period of stagnation or collapse. Really, across the globe, the 20s was a period of growth. There was a very high sense of optimism in this era, especially economically. And
yeah,
he did not implement the plan that would, fully lead to that with I'm trying to remember which year the Dawes plan was enacted, but essentially it was a scheme by which, the Americans would give Germany loans those loans would be used to pay off the war debt to the Entente, and that money paid, the war debt was meant to repay the United States loans. So they would actually be able to stabilize the whole European economy, get paid back on their initial loans, and then have interest on these new loans. It is sometimes blamed for the Great Depression. I think really the American economy collapsed before the German one did. So it contributed to the spread of the Depression globally. But I think Hoover took some actions that really cemented that beyond
Yeah.
this, because it's like you can have economic downturns where loans exist between countries without it becoming so destructive. I don't really buy that the Dawes plan was the wholesale cause of it. And the Dawes plan
Yeah,
also does lower Germany's debt during the time. So he stabilized Germany. Germany in the 20s was a fairly liberal, fairly stabilized country. It wasn't until the Depression hit that we actually get like the Nazis able to wedge themselves back in again.
I feel like Harding is probably is as usually talked about in a super negative sense. Although when actually discussing like what he's done, I don't feel like he's at least what I'm getting. I don't feel like he's really as bad as the people like necessarily down here. Unless I'm just like rating it wrong, of course.
I mean, then again, I don't know too much about Harding. The 20s is kind of a blind spot for me. So he has potential to be worse than what I'm stating here, but I think he's kind of a fair president. He's kind of that first term Cleveland in the way where he doesn't do too much, but you're in an era where not too much needs to be done.
I know he became president by accident. And
Oh yeah, he wasn't wanting
didn't.
to be elected.
Yeah, he continued that attitude throughout his he has that story where he called his dad into the office and he was having a breakdown and he cried to his dad for 3 hours straight and told him but just like I like told him all of his misery, and then his dad uh didn't say anything the whole time until uh he was finished, and his dad was just like, I wish I had a daughter instead, and then he just left.
Wow.
Not
That does
not
remind
related
me.
to the present.
Probably the one kind of like he was fairly like had I believe he had a mistress while in office. And he did just openly disregard prohibition. He would drink beer in the White. He would have parties with drinks in the White House.
Yeah.
Like he really did not care, and I think that kind of just laxness probably did contribute to the growth of maybe, organized crime around the production of alcohol in that era.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure I want to put him too low. He does seem like a fine president, and I think it's like a conservative president or a laissez-faire president is fine when the economy is working. So I don't really want to
Ooh.
hit him too hard just for being against my own political views, especially since he really didn't destroy anything.
So are you thinking like low C then maybe? I think that might.
I'm not necessarily low C. Maybe high C. Maybe
High C? All right. I'm willing to go with that. I think that's fine. Above or below Grant, do you think?
I think I'm gonna put him up. Because that comes into the issue of reconstruction.
Hmm.
Below. Because Grant had a much more difficult time that he was acting with.
Yeah. I think this seems fair to me from what we've been talking about.
I feel like
Calvin
we got a
Coolidge.
fairly decent curve here so far.
Yeah, I think so. This makes
It's
sense to
been
me.
fairly even distribution. Uh, Calvin Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge.
So the
Chud.
famous story of Calvin Coolidge is that he did not like to talk much, and he was once
Yep.
asked at a party if he could The man bet him, if I can get you to say more than 3 words, I win whatever amount of money. Coolidge coldly looked at him and said, "You lose," and then not say another word throughout the entire evening.
uh,
He did not
that
even
sums him up
campaign
pretty
for
well.
president. He just kind of sat in his room. The Democrats were not really well put together during his presidency, so he really did not face any opposition. He did formalize and kind of finally implement the Dawes Plan, but that was more on Harding's administration to design. His probably biggest accomplishment, in my opinion, is the Indian Citizenship Act. I believe, I'm trying to remember. I think it is Charles Curtis is his vice president, who is the one Native American to serve so highly in office, or at least to identify as Native American. I'm not exactly sure on the. Oh no, that would be
On the
during
logistics.
Hoover. That'd be during Hoover, actually. Okay, but
Oh, okay.
we're close to that in timeline. I was fairly close. Um, but that provides citizenship to Native Americans, and essentially, it's the most settled on the issue America really ever becomes. Because there's still economic failures on the reservations, and I believe part of it is due to, in kind of a reaction to how bad Cleveland sell-offs were, is like now the entire tribe has to consent to anything changing in terms of land usage, which leads to a very difficulty in development. But now they at least have citizenship. They have a right to vote. They have rights to social services. It is no longer kind of this series of occupied nations as much as it was before.
Then, I mean,
Uh,
it's. I think pretty famously he just kind of if so we did kind of say that like B was like the tier where they like at least like accomplish something. Do you think that is enough? He
that
he
is
didn't really.
questionable because he also does have some failures in office. There are some natural disasters that he just kind of ignores. He
Yeah,
does not react, does not send federal money. Um, very non-interventionist. He's just kind of like, he really does nothing. He really does so much nothing. And it's fine for the moment, but considering how close we are to the crash,
yeah.
it's like there should have been at least some awareness. I'm willing to give Harding the benefit of the doubt, but with Coolidge, it's more questionable. It's like with Harding, it is just a genuine belief in conservatism. Like he is personally corrupt in some cases, but there is a genuine belief in conservatism. Coolidge, he's just kind of there. I don't even know if he cares.
Yeah, his entire goal was to just get through the presidency with doing as little as he possibly could. And okay, and then in that case, I would probably put him in C because I think in that case, then I think just based on how we've been ranking it, where it's like B is at least they like their accomplishments, they at least like accomplish something. C, and he'd probably be in like a low C in that case. I would say he's probably like maybe he'd be above. He'd probably be right next to Arthur, who also is kind of like a filler president.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
fair. That's fair. So he's above Harrison.
yeah.
I can't wait for people to see believe how wild we are for having Fillmore, Taft, and Hayes so high up. Or is that Hayes? No, that's Garfield. That's Garfield. Hayes is down
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
I mistake the beards.
Uh,
Man without a beard who probably could have used one is Herbert Hoover.
oh,
Um,
Herbert.
it's now Herbert Hoover. He has a really great track record before he's president, but
Yeah,
none
he's
of that
actually
really applies.
he's actually like a pretty famous figure, like nationally. People really like him. He
He's
is
like
like
there was some surprise that he did not run in 1920.
yeah. he I'm trying to think of the specific things that he did before president that were like.
So he managed the relief effort to Belgium. He managed kind of some of the relief efforts to Eastern Europe post World War One. He was an economic manager throughout the 1920s, where he focused on forwarding radio and airplanes as means of communication and travel. So, and like, he was widely regarded as one of the most, in terms of economics, the most intelligent man in America.
Ironic.
It is extremely ironic. It is kind of hilarious how ironic it was. What was not hilarious was living through the first few years of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So, the
Smoot-Hawley tariff.
the one thing I can really think of for him is like he gives an amendment to the Washington Naval Treaty, which like continues that furthering of the Anglo-American alliance, but he fails to respond to the Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff just cascades that crisis internationally. And then one of the most egregious actions is the bonus army. Are you familiar with what the bonus army is?
I know what the bonus army is. Just remind me.
Basically, World War One veterans marched on DC, demanding their bonuses be paid because those bonuses could keep them afloat.
Oh yeah.
During the Depression, and Hoover sent in MacArthur with tanks and gas to disperse them.
Yeah.
It was I could not. It's like that is like I could not imagine a modern president ordering the army on a group of veterans demanding their benefits.
It's kind of insane.
I think I hate that it's like so cliche, but there's a reason he is always in like the bottom rung of presidents.
Yeah, it is. I feel like somebody's gonna get pushed up here. We're gonna see like a reverse cavalcade. See me after class, do you think?
I'm not okay. I think we might have to reassess how we have it ranked in See Me After Class. So Andrew Johnson, we have Pierce. Maybe he pushes Tyler up.
I was gonna say, because I think out of all three of those, I think Tyler is probably the one that I would be I think would make the most sense to go.
Okay.
And in that case, then Martin Van Buren would probably go up to.
Yeah, he'll get bumped. He'll probably get bumped eventually during some certain Californian's term. That leads us into FDR.
Yep.
He now there is a lot of debate around FDR. He is a very contentious, not necessarily when you're talking with historians, but when you're talking with politicians, he is very contentious. I think he's probably the most expansive president. He is the reason the first 100 days as a concept exists because of how much he did upon initially entering office. The first wave of New Deal concepts did not initially stimulate the economy, but the second wave definitely stabilized it. There's obviously the New Deal did not end the Depression, entry into World War II did. But I think when you see how the prosperity of the 50s economy was built off of all of the constructions he made in the 40s. So if they stabilized the 40s, and when we had the economy go back to where it was before, with all the protections he put in place, we had the most stable period. We had the American Golden Age built off of his policies directly after his death. And I think that is in of itself a massive accomplishment because we are from an era that people were outright calling for dictatorship. An era where democracy and capitalism were both in open question by the public.
we saw internationally the growth of fascist states, and that was not out of question for America. In the same year he got elected, there was a film called Gabriel Over the White House, which is a very popular film in which the Archangel Gabriel possesses an incoming president and essentially established a fascist dictatorship, like one for one, and it was phrased as an escapist fantasy. America, I cannot think of anyone else from the era who would have gotten America into the position it was post-war with him. And regarding World War II, I think he managed it very well in terms of diplomacy, balancing the interests of Britain and the Soviet Union, who were both absolutely chomping at each other the whole time, to coordinate the Allies in the way that he did, and then being able to give deference to just the generals and let the professionals run the war without too much political interference, as we saw with Lincoln. Now, obviously, you have to talk about Japanese internment.
Yeah.
That is the biggest negative of his presidency. It was unconstitutional. It has been recognized as unconstitutional legally, and they were given they were paid out to the victims during the Reagan administration for that. That being said, my argument for why I think this is going to sound terrible, it is not as damning as people phrase it, is prior to World War II, is concentration camps, like not death camps, but specifically concentration, rounding up supposed enemy populations for observation and security, was an accepted tactic by just about every nation. We're talking about an era where countries were signing treaties to deport ethnic minorities, and these were seen as moral, upstanding goods to solve crises. And within the camps, there was not the poor conditions you would expect of many of the European concentration camps, and the Japanese were paid during their time there. They did have property confiscated, but they were in some way economically compensated for their time in the camp during it, not necessarily fairly. And they were not death camps. People seem to have this misconception of every concentration camp is a death camp. That was largely relegated to Germany, its allies, and the Soviet Union, as well as Japan with its POW camps.
So I feel like it's the answer is pretty clear. He goes probably an S tier. I think he's probably, I don't know, the way you phrase it makes it sound really inspiring and makes me want to put him above Teddy Roosevelt.
He is personally my candidate for S+, but I do kind of rotate between him and TR. The Roosevelts are my pick for best president of all time. It's like anyone in this S tier you can make a case for.
Yeah.
Like, I would not, anyone can say any of these guys are their favorite president, and I would not be surprised, and I would honestly not disagree with anyone being picked from that rank.
Ethan in the comments says another negative for FDR is court packing.
Okay, so that was a case. The issue I have with that is that never ended up going through. Is he attempted to pack the Supreme Court to expand the number of justices so that he could expand more legislation. He did make some fairly negative statements on the court during that time when they were blocking some of the early New Deal, but he did come to an understanding with them, and the court packing never fully occurred. There hasn't really been any substantial call for court packing since. I think it's kind of just like it was a momentary mistake that never had a material consequence, so I don't really judge him on it too harshly, but I see why others would, because that was an overstepping bounds of the Constitution in that regard. But like I've discussed with you before, I can't think of anyone else in America at the time who would not have overstepped further than FDR did. it was the Depression was a very tense time for America. It was I would I mean, if we rolled the dice, I wouldn't be surprised if we're in the minority where we came out as a single, stable, democratic, capitalist state.
Yeah, if you look at like every timeline side by side. I think I'm fine with just leaving FDR up there, and we'll have our discussion about which one is going to make it into S plus. I think this is probably going to end up being our
Contenders. I
Yeah,
don't think there's anyone who comes near these
Yeah, no.
four in the following year, especially once we get past
Yeah.
Clinton. I don't think we really have any really strong contenders for S or S plus at all.
And Truman.
Okay, Truman. Okay, so opinions on Truman are very vitriolic to some people. I think people overemphasize the bomb as a function of his presidency. It was being developed throughout all of World War II. Basically every country was developing a bomb, and it shortened World War II. Is the long and short of it. Is it in the net end? I think it decreased the amount of deaths.
Yeah.
So I think most people get a bit too hung up on it because it just becomes a political issue.
Yeah,
and the Soviets tried to politicize it. So
then I think similarly to he's got that Chester Arthur problem where I feel like it was probably going to happen almost no matter who got into that position. So I feel like I think functionally blaming it on him is probably not like an 100%. It's not like 100%.
Yeah. So
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you continue.
I was just to say, I think the big obvious negative for him is I think the Cold War.
Yeah, so he definitely causes the Cold War. So if you look between basically both America and the Soviet Union perceived what each other were doing internally as defensive actions as innately offensive, just to differing culture and miscommunication.
Mm.
And Truman was definitely a portion of why that happened. That being said, the Marshall Plan does stabilize Europe, and he is able to really rally the world in defense for the Korean War. It is impressive what he was able to accomplish in that regard. The issue comes down to he is trying to fulfill the mandate of FDR. That is how he phrases his presidency. And I think that's probably the most respectable stance of a vice president is it is not necessarily my positions, but it is filling out the positions of the person you elected. So he does further the New Deal somewhat. He does the final push that FDR was never able to accomplish, which he set aside for post-war, was the establishment of a healthcare system.
Mm.
And Truman largely fails to do so. Because the initial idea of the GI Bill was that it would be pushed out to veterans, and then the rest of America would go, "Oh my God, this is so amazing! We need to push this out further. It's stabilizing everything. Veterans can get homes, educations, and healthcare from the government, and it's going to help so many people." The issue is he was not able to push it past that portion, and we're going to see a major conservative backlash during his midterm elections, which leads to the worst legislation of his presidency is the Taft-Hartley bill, which he is opposed to, but it's an unvetoable majority. And it basically ties the hands of any sort of strike. So sit-in strikes are not allowed. That's the most major thing. So basically, if you are striking, it is now guaranteed that the company is just going to hire a strike breaker to do your job in the time being, which greatly limits the ability of people to protest. So we are at a fairly stable position in terms of in terms of, the working class's ability to do things, to have a functioning economy, to have security, but the teeth are being taken away, and he is unable to stop that. The other things, along with the Cold War, is domino theory and its consequences. He's going to be blamed for China falling to communism, which is going to lead to, that the Republicans gaining a supermajority.
Mm.
And that is going to set a kind of standard going forward, is Democratic presidents are going to be more hardline on foreign policy because they suspect if they don't, they'll end up like Truman and have their hands tied. And that, as well as the rise of McCarthyism, which he openly opposed. I think it's just Truman was met with forces which he was not able to fully quell, but he does see the capping off of FDR's legislative agenda.
Where are you? I know I'm feeling, I don't know. Personally, I feel like a B plus is a pretty good area for him.
I think before Taft, do you think?
Yeah, I'd say probably before Taft. I was actually gonna say like even like maybe ahead of Taft, but I think I'll leave that up to you.
I think we'll place him here. I think Jefferson still has, being able to establish the nation.
Yeah, it's a pretty big one.
Oh, Captain Sham, you are going to be so disappointed. I am so sorry. I am not a Reagan fan. I don't think either of us are Reagan fans.
No, not crazy about him.
I think there are a few more Republicans on here I quite like, but Reagan is not one of them. So Eisenhower. So what is kind of funny about Eisenhower is his decision to run in the Republican Party is largely because he doesn't want Robert Taft or General MacArthur to win. So those are the two other major people are expecting to be the Republican candidate, and he's just like, I hate both of those people. So he runs as a Republican, most kind of on the part of that, and also because it was closer to where his just grew up as a child, what they did. But he really did not care about partisan politics very much. He was probably maybe not the last, but the last good liberal Republican before the party began to go fully conservative, starting in the 60s and into the modern day. I think he was a great unifying figure. If I had to pick a president to revive to lead the country right now, it would be Eisenhower.
That's a good take, I think.
You continue.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I actually always feel like I know more about Eisenhower than I do, like what he did. I know that he's the reason the interstate highway exists. That was a big part of it.
Yes. That is a major portion of his domestic agenda. He kind of morally and physically unites America.
I will say also, on that note, I know this is going to come up later, and it's not during his presidency specifically, but he is a big part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, averting that, specifically with Eisenhower's help, is how JFK ends up diffusing that, or mostly diffusing that. Other than that, I'm not really sure.
So yeah, that gets us kind of into his foreign policy. So he has an expansive foreign policy, and your opinion on it really depends on the foreign policy stance you take. between liberalism and realism, which probably should have better names as ideologies, but that's the ones we're working with because it's just kind of like it kind of gives too much credit to the quote unquote realists.
Yeah.
He had a very realist foreign policy because this man established the CIA. He held a coup in Iran. He influenced Latin America with intelligence organizations, and he was the person to begin allowing fascist Spain and dictatorial Portugal into the NATO system. So, in terms of like short term, and in some terms even long term, gaining a foot up on the Soviets, those are all pretty big achievements, but they're all morally reprehensible.
Right, right.
The foundation of the CIA is going to be a massive stain going forward. I don't necessarily. I mean, the CIA wishes it had the power that conspiracy theorists think it has. It's like if they had even like close to it, the world would be so much different. But it does kind of set this belief in the American mind, especially going forward, that hey, we don't respect the autonomy of other nations, and other nations feel that very heavily. He does kind of begin involvement in Nam, but it's mostly relegated to like aid and some small occupations of logistical centers. It's not really a war. It's like it's on the same level of interventions we currently have in Africa that no one has ever heard about or cares about. It's like it's only notable because it eventually leads to more when worse decisions are made by other presidents. The final thing is he is an architect of mutually assured destruction as a strategy. And that may sound terrible on the face of it, but you got to contextualize that in his kind of disdain for the military industrial complex, which is ironic, I know. Because if you're expecting a war with the Soviets, like everyone was expecting the Cold War to go hot any minute, if you're not relying on mutually assured destruction, you're relying on conventional forces, which would mean continued revitalizing and new equipment as things get marginally better to keep an edge. It would mean probably some sort of peacetime draft to keep the army up to standard. It would mean the massive expansion of the federal budget into the military sector to maintain everything over that long period of time for basically an indefinite period is what he's looking at. So rather he sets up, intercontinental ballistic missiles targeted at the Soviets. If you hit us, we hit you back. No one wins, which ends up being net cheaper. And we're going to see that continue until the Reagan administration. Well, the Carter administration, actually, but everyone just gives the credit to Reagan because Reagan bumped it up to 11.
I have no idea.
I usually place him in A tier.
I think that's fair.
I'm not sure. I mean, Domino Theory is kind of replacing the Monroe Doctrine, which is my argument for maybe pushing him above Monroe. And also just the heightened complexity of the presidency in the 20th century compared to the early 19th.
Yeah. He's just, I mean, I think that feels right to me.
Okay, and now Kennedy for me.
There he is.
His biggest accomplishment, banging Marilyn Monroe while in the White House.
That's at least B+.
That's S+ tier, just because he's hot. So Kennedy he's overrated. Everyone knows he's overrated. Like once you dive into any history, he had the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's like you cause and resolve the same conflict, and you only resolve it by the skin of your teeth.
Yeah.
the real material change is increased communication between the Soviets and Americans. Which is good. Most of his stuff is fairly positive, but I think looking forward, he's going to run into all the friction Johnson ran into, and likely more because Johnson had the advantage of saying, "I'm doing what Kennedy wanted" the entire time, while Kennedy would just have the advantage of saying, "I'm doing what I want as a partisan president." Um,
I think JFK's impact is undoubtedly much more cultural than anything
yeah.
like really tangible.
Like you see ridiculous like things people phrase. Space program has to count for something, right? Yeah, if he ran the race instead of just declaring it.
Yeah. He
Because
basically like, yeah.
Eisenhower was the one who established NASA. LBJ does all the spending to get us to the moon. Nixon's the president who happens to be in power when we land. JFK just gives a good speech. Like, I mean, I'm being a bit reductive, but he gives a good speech. What do you want me to say? It's like I can't in good faith place him as a bad president, but I can't really call him a good president either, because it's like he was everything that was accomplished off of his back was accomplished because he died.
In I'm actually not sure if I'm getting this right, so feel free to correct me. The Civil Rights Act bill, I don't remember what it's called, that gets passed under Johnson's administration. I think wasn't that first put into motion under JFK? And would we
Okay.
do that?
So we need to get into civil rights. So Ike did kind of begrudgingly help on civil rights with moving the Guard, nationalizing the Guard in some southern states to protect integration. JFK drafted the bill, but you got to remember Johnson is a whip. He knows how to gather votes. We got a Southern Democrat who is like one of the most intimidating figures, who has like he knows how to get Congress to do whatever the fuck he wants, leading this, versus Northern Democrat from Boston leading this. While he is like important in the policy design aspect, I'm not sure he would have been able to implement it. I mean, just look at a map of 1960 versus the 1964 election. The mandate for Johnson was massive. And as soon as he signed the Civil Rights Bill, that mandate evaporated.
All right. Well, I think that's fair. That answers my query in that case.
So
I think would you go as far as to put him in B? I feel like
B. I mean, I can put him at the bottom of B and see if he gets bumped.
All right, I think that makes sense.
Oh, someone else has joined. I haven't seen Sculpture in the chat. Congratulations, you missed everything.
Yeah.
Millard Fillmore is a almost on the cusp of A tier according to us, so that's what you've been missing. I can't wait to post this and get absolutely bodied. What the fuck is Harrison doing in B tier? Okay, that brings us to probably one of the most complex presidents, LBJ.
Yeah.
So he takes power after Kennedy dies. I'm not really going to go into any. I don't believe in any of the JFK conspiracies because I think they're all mostly bullshit.
Mm.
It's like you can find holes in any history, and people just love to fucking shout about it. I think Let Me Know probably had the best video on it where he just went through it's like how everything that would have needed to go into a conspiracy for JFK to die. So I'm not going to go on the whole Johnson killed Kennedy bullshit that people love. Even beyond that, now Johnson is probably the most ambitious in terms of expanding the New Deal. Like both Eisenhower and Kennedy kind of have their small expansions, like Eisenhower in infrastructure, Kennedy, the New Frontier agenda. But LBJ's Great Society and War on Poverty are very heavily designed to kind of finish out the ideas of the New Deal. They don't fully succeed, though, largely because I don't think some poor design aspects, but they do benefit a lot of people in the short run until they are limited later. Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act cannot go unmentioned. He is the president to remove nationality quotas from immigration as well, which leads into the Mexican civil rights movement. Medicare and Medicaid, which continue to this day, were part of his agenda.
I always forget that's part of him.
He manages the longest portion of the space race, but he falls into that Truman trap we were talking about earlier, where he sees any sort of de-escalation in Vietnam as an opening for the Republicans to attack him. So he continuously escalates. He does lie to the American public about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's kind of muddled when the news gets to him, but he definitely continues. If the first one was by mistake, he does not reconcile it. If the first incorrect statement on it was unknowingly false, he never reconciles that. Expands Vietnam. Vietnam truly becomes a war under him. Kennedy did some expansion. In fact, Eisenhower criticized Kennedy, not necessarily for expanding, but for where he went lax in Vietnam that led to difficulties later. But LBJ, it's a real war with him. We get the draft and everything. He does it over Congress, so it is an undeclared war. And he truly breaks the New Deal coalition. Part of it is the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Part of it is overextending the war on poverty. A large portion is the war in Vietnam. But in 1968, essentially the Democratic Party of Roosevelt dies. In Chicago, there are fights within the convention. There are fist fights, and outside there are riots. It is absolute chaos. The New Deal coalition that FDR assembled was the largest Big Tent coalition in history. Truman was able to at least get it back together, a crisis coalition during peacetime, and Johnson saw it collapse in his hands. More physically, is he, in an attempt to not have the American public feel the war as much, he funds the war with inflation, which we will see has consequences during, especially Ford, is when it starts getting out of control. But it's because he has some of the most ambitious domestic and foreign policy, and he just overstretches and collapses. In terms of the effects on your daily life today, Medicare and Medicaid are massive. The Civil Rights Act is massive. The war on poverty, even though it ultimately got pulled back, was massive. In terms of your material day-to-day life, he's probably close to FDR and Eisenhower.
So are you suggesting that he would probably be in do you think he would be in a similar position then to Jefferson, where he kind of has to be at least in high B plus because he's established so much, but there's just enough holding him back that it doesn't really.
I can see that. I see that argument. It's part of me, it's you want to rip off half his face, call it Vietnam, and toss it in F tier, and then put the rest in A.
Yeah.
But I think that's a fair assessment, is considering how we have ranked other people today. Now, we are going to get into Richard Nixon.
Ooh.
Now, the way I always describe Nixon to people is if you wanted to play a game of chess against Nixon, is he would study every chess game ever played. He would become a chess master before you even entered the room, and then he would hire a guy to break your ankles. It's like he would do everything to win on the legal front, and then he would commit a crime to guarantee his victory anyway. This isn't very well known, but he did collude with the Johnson administration and some dubious intelligence foreign powers in 68 to get a one-up on that election. So he's already committing crimes before he's even entered office for his term. You can't really talk about Nixon without Watergate, but that aside, he's kind of fairly impressive. He opens China and starts a period of cooling with the Soviet Union. The Environmental Protection Act, Apollo 11 during his presidency. There's one other thing that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head that I didn't have written down.
As like a positive?
As a positive, yeah.
Oh.
Nixon had a surprisingly decent list of positives. But then we get to the negatives, and I think he's one of the ones where the negatives outweigh the positives. We're gonna see
the first point. I think. I mean, I think it's debatable whether this is like the worst thing he did. War on drugs was probably like one of the biggest failures. I think in like. I don't know. I don't want to say like in all of American history because I feel like
it depends on how you define failure. In terms of like morality, obviously yes, but in terms of policy design, it did everything you wanted it to do. It's like that. This is what I mean with Nixon. Is like when he is that realpolitik. It's like you see all the morally reprehensible stuff that he is, but he did it in such a strange, effective manner that makes you want to admire and hate him more. It's I think that is that is one of the worst things. I would argue Watergate might take the cake because Watergate is what's going to destroy American trust in governance.
Yeah.
I mean, from Theodore Roosevelt to Nixon, the assumption was the government was a good moral force. After Nixon, that assumption becomes impossible for a generation. And if anything else, the worst crime is working with Kissinger. I mean, yeah, Kissinger does some fucking crazy shit. I mean, there's a genocide in Bangladesh that Kissinger just kind of signs off on and Nixon ignores.
Yeah,
I think
that's a really big. That's a really big deal.
War on drugs. Continued Vietnam. Now, what's interesting with Vietnam is he does end the draft and he does like decrease bombing. Basically, what he does is he takes both sides on Vietnam. He doesn't end it, but he does a lot to make Americans feel it less at home. Which I mean, on one hand, he's like, oh yeah, we shouldn't have to feel the foreign conflicts at home. But on the other hand, that's just because he knows that's what people actually care about because he's that realpolitik. He sees everyone as selfish. So it's like, as long as you don't feel the consequences, do you care? And that's going to go into the policy design of the war on drugs as well. So he is probably going to have to go into F tier just because of who he is, what he stands for, and everything that he did. But I think he is kept out of the See Me After class.
I would probably put him
by
at
the
top
effective.
of F.
Yeah, he's the top of F, so he's going to bump out Van Buren. Yeah, he's a something right there.
Yeah.
And now we are going to talk about a president that came in after one of the most controversial ones in history. One is dealing with massive inflation, and one who famously withdrew from one of America's longest forever wars. But enough about Joe Biden. Here's Gerald Ford. So the Gerald Ford Joe Biden comparisons continue to amuse me. The biggest thing of his presidency, one of the large aspects, was he was trying to deal with the inflation of the Johnson and Nixon administrations. He also had to deal with the OPEC embargo, which led to stagflation and the oil crisis of the 1970s. That does lead to an establishment of the Strategic Oil Reserve, which is fairly decent. He pardons draft dodgers and supported the Equal Rights Amendment, but it goes nowhere. Overall, I think he could have been a fairly half-decent president. The issue comes down to Nixon's pardon and the withdrawal from Vietnam. Is because Ford wants to see himself as this unifying figure in the nation. And he thinks the best way to do that is to give a blanket pardon to Nixon. What that then tells everyone instead is anyone can get away with anything in politics. Is because if Nixon had faced justice for his crimes, then there is a debate that trust in government could have been restored. I mean, but there was so much going on: the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal, continued involvement in Vietnam, the increasing presence of the CIA in foreign policy, and Ford flops on his face and makes it look like a corrupt bargain happened. And then Saigon falls. He is like the poster boy for if you need a president who is not necessarily malicious, but you need the government to be stupid, he would be my pick for who you would place. The best thing he probably did was the blanket pardon to draft dodgers.
Yeah.
Which was a unifying force in the nation, but that's just... It doesn't make up for Nixon's pardon,
Yeah.
I'm going to go low D, like bottom of D.
Bottom of D? All right. Bottom of D.
Yeah.
I think... Okay. I mean, I'll side with it. I would have put him higher, probably.
Where would you put him personally? I'm curious.
I probably would have put him, actually, I think maybe below Adams, above McKinley. I think your placement makes sense. I see the reasoning.
Yeah, I think it's because it's he's so tied to Nixon. You kind of got to place them side by side.
Yeah,
okay.
It's like the Jackson Van Buren thing.
Yeah, it's like Jackson and Van Buren. They're very intertied together in terms of what they accomplish. And now we get to history's greatest monster, Jimmy Carter. Thank you, 2003 Toyota Camry, for agreeing with me on Gerald Ford. Okay. Now we're getting into Jimmy Carter. So, a lot of what people think of as originating in the Reagan administration actually kind of starts subtly with Carter. So the Carter Doctrine, which he establishes, is basically the solution to the oil crisis. And it basically reads, the USA will intervene in the Middle East whenever we need to. So yeah, that's the start of that whole fiasco. Mm-hmm. He started some deregulation, which Reagan's gonna really, Carter is defined but people forget as a illustrious career was to be president. Yeah. Carter's worst moment in his life was being president, probably. He really everything he does is kind of like a toned down version of Reagan, because we're starting to see that shift in politics. Just starting, because the conservatism from Nixon remains after Nixon. Gerald
Ford is probably one of the last liberal Republicans, and he's collapsing on the face of it. The Democratic Party is in shambles. So now we really just have the conservative forces, and they're starting to act on Carter, and he can't really change anything about that. The one he did establish the Department of Education and got the Camp David Accord signed, which was the peace between Egypt and Israel, and is the main reason why Egypt remains an American ally to this day. Like, even through all the shit going on currently, Egypt is still a fairly firm American ally. So those are accomplishments of his administration, but he was not a people person. When the president comes out and says we are in a crisis of confidence openly, says like, this nation doesn't know what it's doing.
Yeah.
He was just not the figure we needed at the time. I think he was kind of cursed. It was kind of a curse that the Nixon to Ford transition where it happened, because it guaranteed a Democrat was going to be in power, but it also guaranteed they weren't really going to be able to change much.
I think Jimmy Carter generally is agreed upon to be. I don't think I feel right putting him down with like F. I would probably, the way it's kind of built right now, I think maybe, I don't know, where would you, I would put him in D is where I was going to say, but where
D,
would you?
I'm not sure. D, I'm like, he'd be definitely above Adams. I kind of hesitate to put him behind Hayes, so maybe we put him C.
All right, I think that's valid.
Or maybe, I think
it could be like a low C.
I'm gonna put him ahead of Coolidge.
I think that actually probably makes sense to me. Yeah, because I don't feel like
I don't think anyone's gonna be like Coolidge is better than Carter. I think some of these tiers are kind of flexible in the middle.
Yeah.
It's like you can switch around these middles and it's not really going to change much. It's like anyone who knows, it's like opinions constantly change. I'm probably going to come back after this and be like, no, Adams really should have been an S+. And now we get to Ronald Reagan.
Speaking of S+.
Yeah, goddamn. So you can't really talk about Reagan without talking about high treason. That's a sad fact. Everyone knows about the Iran-Contra affair during his presidency, but what people don't know about is that he openly talked with Iran behind everyone's back, well, secretly, to keep the hostage crisis going until he became president. So there's a lot of people, especially in my dad's generation or like some of his coworkers, that Lord Reagan, it was like the day Reagan was sworn into office, the Iranians let the hostages go. Because he was so amazing and they knew he was going to bomb the shit out of them. But really, it's because he promised behind everyone's back that he was going to give them better terms. Both of those are high treason.
Yeah.
Reaganomics is not a successful political economic system. He caused massive deficit spending to bump up the military. It's debatable of how much that contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was kind of on its last legs.
Yeah.
By his time anyway. He expanded the Afghanistan conflict, and by the policy design, that led to the rise of the Taliban. People kind of conflate that he just gave guns directly to Taliban. The way it worked is we gave guns to Pakistan, and Pakistan decided which portions of the Afghani resistance received them, and they favored the Taliban. He's just generally, I do not like Reagan, AIDS.
Yeah, I would say the extreme mishandling of the, I guess not even handling at all.
The lack of handling of AIDS.
Yeah. Although interesting point in favor of Reagan. He is the reason why hearing aids are so accessible to the general public. That is a little bit of a point there.
I know Bush is going to expand on that as well once we get to him.
Mm-hmm. It's about securing the old person vote. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm not
And
surprised. I think. I mean, where do you want to put Reagan? So I don't think we really need to do too much discussion. We both have a disdain for our generation. Generally, either like loves him or sees him as the devil.
I would. I mean, I would feel it. Do you think it's really hard to like justify like moving anybody out of See Me After Class? So I would probably put him like. I think I would put him. I would put him below Nixon at least. I think.
Yeah, I can see below Nixon. That does mean we need to bump someone out of F tier. Do we want to bump Nixon out of F?
I think I'd be fine with. I think I'd be fine with putting Nixon in low D, personally.
Okay.
I think the China thing is enough to justify it with me. That's a pretty big point.
Yeah, I think it is kind of really like the way I phrase it when I'm trying to explain like the politics, like Reagan is Nixon without the subtlety.
Yeah.
And as a crusader, like if Nixon wanted something done, he'd find a way to get it done. If Reagan would want the exact same thing, but he would just put a gun in your face.
Yeah. And next is Herbert Walker, HW.
I quite like Herbert Walker. I think he was effective foreign policy president when we needed that.
I actually don't know a lot about HW.
So HW, Reagan is largely given credit for the end of the Cold War, probably erroneously, but HW is the one who actually has to handle it. And he handles it fairly well. Because we see a collapse of the Soviet Union that is peaceful, does not really see many initial conflicts. We're not going to see really collapse that until the Clinton administration. We're also going to see, I think, the single most effective foreign U.S. intervention in the Gulf War. And I don't say that just because it succeeded, but because of what it established. We're now in the post-Soviet sphere. You know, countries are looking around trying to figure out what the rules are. And Saddam unilaterally invades Kuwait. HW assembles the single largest coalition in UN history and defeats one of the top 5 armies in the world in under 100 hours. Looks Saddam dead in the eyes, says, "I don't want regime change. I just want to let down the rules that, countries don't get to invade other countries just because the Cold War's over now. We're still enforcing global peace," and promptly leaves. Other interventions, as we get Panama, where we're able to maintain global trade through the Panama Canal after the Panamanians try to enforce it. Basically, it's like he just does foreign policy right, in my opinion. He is that Teddy speak softly and carry a big stick, where there is an established goal. We go in, wreck shit, get our exact goal done, and then leave. There is no overbearing. There is no nation building. It is just what we need done, and then it's done. And it leads to very little collateral damage overall. Being able to establish peaceful relations with the new Russia to the point that there's like debates of Yeltsin trying to get into the EU and NATO is an accomplishment. We got the Civil Rights Act of 1991. Big mark against him is he did support NAFTA. He kind of drafted it. Reagan set down the concept. He drafted it. Clinton would pass it. And you can debate how NAFTA was, but it did end up removing American industry from the country, and it was partially his policy design, which is in effect. But I think he was a foreign policy expert, is what he was, and I think he expertly handled the end of the Cold War before Clinton gets the chance to bungle it.
All right. I'll let you take the reins. Where do you think HW goes?
I kind of honestly feel A tier for him. I like the man.
A tier? Okay. I'll go with it.
I quite like the man. And I think this is the last Republican I will like. I will admit that out loud. And I think he does kind of accept, Reagan's voodoo economics, but he doesn't, as he calls it,
Insert HW baseball. Yeah, thank you. Now we get to Clinton, and I think Clinton is kind of he's the reason the Democrats go fully conservative in the 90s and onward. He basically he runs on being on liberal policy. There's a famous like clip of him being like, the reason we're in a slump right now is because we have spent 12 years on a failed economic system. And then he immediately adopts that economic system. He just Clinton's the reason the Democrats, the hot take that people have that Democrats and Republicans are literally the same is an accurate statement between the election of Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton leaving office. Is what I would like to say on that front. He was the cool president. He did in fact play the saxophone and got laid a lot, but he's going to kind of fail on foreign policy. So the one feather in his cap, he's going to be able to limit the Bosnian genocide in our intervention in Yugoslavia, mostly through an air campaign. But then he does nothing about the Rwandan genocide. There's the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia. During his presidency is when we really start implementing shock therapy in Eastern Europe, which is basically the concept of, hey, the best way for you to become capitalist is for total 100% free market capitalism, which just leads to oligarchs gaining monopolies in Russia, complete collapse in the economies of Eastern Europe. I think by like the end of the mid 90s, there is like a 50% poverty rate in Russia. The reason no Russian will ever, praise the fall of the Soviet Union is kind of comes down to Clinton. And it's kind of weird because it's like we had such prosperity and we looked at him, it's like, haha, this is the funny president where the worst thing he did was fuck his secretary. It's like, and he does that. He embraces the kind of Republican stance on crime with the 1994 crime bill, which is going to make a lot of things worse for incarceration and move back prisoners' rights substantially. I mean, he just, on the Republicans, he just added the Democrats to the coalition. He accepted the Reagan era as the status quo, and then he bungled Americans' global stance. Not as much as the next guy will, but
yeah. Oh yeah, we got to this guy first before we're into that one. I do feel pretty confidently about putting him in, I think, C. But I don't know where I would really put him in C, because I feel like C is like, I don't feel right putting him in B because I don't think that's right. Do you think, I was gonna say, do you think D would be right even? Or he would probably be like low C if he was like.
Yeah, I'm going to put him in low C. Ahead of Coolidge. I think he's
I think that looks right to me. I think that makes sense.
Yeah. It's just because he's next to another colored picture. That's going to bring us into the truly modern presidents. These are presidents that were in power while we were alive. And it might get a bit spicy now.
I feel pretty strongly about this one.
Yeah, okay, so are we going to put Bush, are we going to have Bush bump someone in F tier or Bush bump someone in See Me After Class?
That is the question.
This is where the cascades are going to begin.
Yeah. I don't know. Herbert Hoover's. I feel like the See Me After Class tier is like really solidified right now. I don't know. But I don't know, man. I would maybe even put do you think? My question, genuine question, do you think a Franklin Pierce would be worth moving out for Bush? Is my
Oof.
question.
I feel like it would be more worthy to move out Hoover because Pierce was a leading cause of the Civil War.
That's true. That's true. And I feel like if Herbert, it's more about him like being there at the wrong time. Maybe he did make things worse, but like I think Bush is worse than Hoover. I think.
I think who do we want to push up out of F tier then?
Uh, that is.
Dude, the bottom's gonna be crowded real soon. I'll say that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I think our last A tier is probably gonna just get bumped up from somebody else.
I'm gonna say it's out of everybody there. I'd probably move actually Wilson up a tier. I think it does kind of feel weird that
And that's gonna move Hayes up. Do we want to move Hayes up? I think Hayes is probably. Ooh, I don't know. I think Adams is like the most eligible to be bumped up.
yeah
Just because of founding father status, really, and the Marshall Court.
yeah it's okay. It's a big. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And then we got to bump up someone from C. Oof. Dude, the rest of this is just gonna be us bumping people.
I guess it has to be Grant by default. I think
Yeah.
it feels kind of weird, but I guess. All right.
I mean, he's nowhere near the top 10, so it's still fair.
Yeah.
Do we want to go into Bush? We should probably talk about why we put Bush this low.
I think Bush completely annihilated completely annihilated the position the U.S. had.
Yeah.
I think
So we enter 2000 as the global superpower. The global superpower. We enter 2008 as not.
I think I was just added to the list the fuck, was it Iraq or Iran? I can't remember. Iraq, yeah. Sorry, my bad. The invasion of Iraq, the whole like nuclear, the false weapons of mass destruction thing. One of the biggest, I think, fumbles in the U.S. history. Probably, I think I would say contender for the worst.
Yeah. So Bush's invasion of Iraq, definitely bad. There's an argument to be made that the resources withheld from Afghanistan for Iraq is the reason bin Laden is able to slip away in the first year into Pakistan, which, is going to expand the Afghanistan war as well. And then I think the Bush administration kind of creates that, because he's never honest about the war, creates that populist myth that it's like we just invade countries for oil, which I think is fairly false, especially in Iraq, because you can see where that oil goes. That oil goes to China. We don't make much money off Iraqi oil. It was more so just like Bush had a genuine belief, and his administration had a genuine belief that they were just like so good they could go in and topple a dictator and make a stable democracy if they felt like it. To pressure, and then the pressure Iran into doing the same. It was a ridiculous plan built off the flimsiest of evidences, and was they had to lie deliberately to the American public to do it. And that's only part of his presidency. That's only his foreign policy.
Yeah. So I think Bush, in order to secure the he leans into the elderly vote, which like was super hard. the Christians, conservative, extremists. I think this is a really big point for me, honestly, is he starts to condemn the idea of stem cell research and completely pushes the U.S. out of the running for that completely. He shuts it all down, and it sets us like so far back in terms, which is a big thing because I think at this point the U.S. has not really been a scientific superpower for a little bit, but this I think completely knocks us out of the race completely. That's a big personal thing for me.
That is, I see that, and we also get No Child Left Behind, which is going to mess with education as well.
That's a massive thing. And then what was the act where
Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act. That's what I was thinking of.
Stomps on the First Amendment, and then he's not wholly to blame for 2008's financial crisis. There is the deregulation was kind of forwarded by Reagan and subsequently Bush. The direct deregulations, like the specific laws that would allow the banks to get this ridiculous, was signed under Clinton. But then Bush, it's like there were a lot of warning signs. There were several banks going under beforehand, several like financial institutions that were like laid hollow in the early 2000s that he did nothing to address. But the thing is, the most redeeming quality of Bush's administration I can really think of is that the 3 best Halo games were released during his presidency, which means he's up.
True.
The original Halo trilogy is all released under the Bush administration. That's a thing to think about. No, there is an argument to be made that 2007 is the cultural height of America, where you can go play Halo 3 before the financial crash.
Oh, Bush.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it might be due to recency, but also it's like that is fairly bad. I see someone saying put him in turn Buchanan in the Bush tier. The only way that I could willingly do that is if Bush, within the next month before he dies or whatever, leads some sort of uprising against the Constitution. It's like until Bush leads an armed uprising, I am not going to place him lower than see me after class.
I think this is a pretty reasonable spot for Bush.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get very vitriolic and push him lower. We'll talk about vitriol in a minute. Now we get to Barack Obama. I kind of put him in the JFK category, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree.
It's kind of more severe than JFK because he comes in on a much larger mandate than Kennedy did. He was like the first big tent or potential for a big tent party in a long time that the Democrats had. And he failed to utilize that mandate. He failed to limit the war on terror, transitioned it all to nation building, which kept it in forever wars. He failed to address the protest movements that led to the radicalization, because Occupy, the Tea Party, and BLM all start under his admin, and all of those are still forces in American politics that have not really been reined in or addressed. So I can not really put him above B tier, to be honest. Like, he's going to be remembered in 100 years as the first black president, and that's about it.
Yeah,
I mean, there is the Affordable Care Act, but that's been fairly gutted, and almost all of he had some foreign policy wins, but most of them were gutted by Trump.
Yeah, I would put him. I think the JFK thing is actually a pretty apt comparison. But I don't know whether I would put him above or below. Generally, I think maybe below.
Yeah, I can't place him in good faith above Grant.
Oh,
I think that seems fair.
I think that, yeah, okay, that seems right.
Okay. And now we have Donald J. Trump.
There he is.
Yes, the part of this that is going to keep me from being able to swear my oaths or whatever the fuck. In short, Donald J. Trump was not the disastrous worst president of all time that many people make him out to be, but he was still a pretty bad president. His biggest issue wasn't really necessarily any specific policy, but more that how polarizing a figure he personally was.
Yeah.
It's like there's kind of this concept that it's like there is like not just the Constitution, but there is like the Constitution as a document and the Constitution as a conception of normal, of what is acceptable. And he tore up what is that conception of normal and then began to attack the physical document near the end of his administration with the open denial of the election even before it began, which makes me want to bop him down a fair amount. Trade war with China was largely a failure. I'm not as against protectionism as a lot of people, so I don't fault him too much on that. But I think Biden has been more efficient with it.
Personally, I would probably lean. Oh, Klausing said it too in the comments. I would say probably low C. Maybe
Maybe not
D.
low C. I think D. D seems kind of fair, and then we can who do we bump up from D?
That's a good question. I'm not letting. I don't think I could in good faith let McKinley go above. So I would probably rather Hayes.
Yeah, Hayes, and then we need to bump someone up from C.
That's really rough because there's no way in hell that anybody there. I guess.
Kind of just for being a placeholder. No, not placeholder can't be in B.
Yeah, exactly. That's because we established that's like they at least like accomplished something.
That's kind of everyone down here did not accomplish anything. I mean, we're still fairly balanced. So if we just want to have C be one higher,
I think that's where I'm kind of leaning right now.
and then we can adjust after Biden. I think. Okay. My take on Biden is B+.
Really?
So I think when we talk about the modern presidents, especially, people will go, Trump had a great economy, but that's because, Obama made that economy. And people go, Obama had a bad economy because Bush made that economy. He's inherited the economy of Trump. And I think he's trying to deal with it. The issue is like the moment news started reporting inflation is every company under the sun like doubled the inflation rate and then applied that to their prices. Like, nope, this is just what the rate of inflation is. Trust us. That's kind of out of what he can do at the moment. I think in terms of foreign policy, he was able to effectively rally the entirety of the world around Ukraine. I mean, approval of American foreign policy by other countries, by our allies, their appreciation of us, their like ability to work with America has not been higher since before Bush. He recovered that. We're getting back on a Kyoto Protocol and all that stuff. We have the CHIPS Act, which is CHIPS Act and other less tariffy and more investment to bring American production home, especially for vital goods. So even as we're bringing in our kind of trade and making it more centered, the world still likes us more. We're increasing infrastructure spending. And the Inflation Reduction Act is at least trying on that. I think the inflation really came out of the end of the Trump administration with the response to COVID, and it's just kind of something we're dealing with. He's decently handling it. I don't think people are freaking out. I think a bit more than they need to be.
I mean, I think I don't know. I'm not. All right, I'll say it's fine. I'll say B. B plus probably works. I mean, I still think it's like I don't know. I don't know how crazy I am about it, but I think you bring up good points.
Like hot take, Biden is going to be remembered, at least by historians or decent historians who aren't hacks, better than Obama.
I like Sculpture's idea. You can move Biden down to B, and then move Henry Harrison up to B plus.
Yeah,
That's a
good.
joke, by the way. You don't have to do that.
Yeah,
I
feel like Henry Harrison's still gonna remain in B. He didn't really do. I mean, we're just going off speculation, so we have no idea. And that is the rankings. We just need to decide. Someone needs to get bumped up from a B plus to a A tier. I think I'm gonna move Millard Fillmore down to the bottom of B plus.
All right.
And then we can move. I think probably Jefferson's gonna go up to A. Or who do you think? Maybe I'm just with Jefferson and Truman, honestly.
That's kind of where I'm at too. I feel like I think I would actually feel more right putting Truman in A tier than I would Jefferson. Honestly.
Okay. Let's see. We need to move. Who would we move up from B tier to B plus, do you think?
This is tough, man.
Not Grant. We already kind of bumped Grant up.
Yeah, and it's not Henry. Grover. I don't know enough about JQC to really say specifically. He's kind of an enigma to me. A little bit.
I mean, we can give him a lot of the credit for some of the stuff during the Monroe administration as well. So we can bump him up because he was very pivotal in a lot of that. So I'm kind of willing to count that as well.
I'm fine. I think I'd be all right with bumping him up to B plus.
And then, is there anyone from C tier you think is worthy of B tier right now?
No.
Let me think. I mean, debating. Maybe we bump up Chester. Because we do have Garfield kind of high, and he kind of is the expansion of that. What was our downside on Arthur? That was the Chinese exclusion.
Yeah.
And we kind of were like that was going to be like decided. That was going to be signed by anyone who was in office at the time.
That's true. I think actually, yeah, maybe putting him in B would actually not be that bad of an idea.
So, yeah, I think this is
very organized.
This is kind of fair. We're going to have some hot takes according to other people, but now that comes us down to selecting the greatest president of all time. There is no tension here, no. Now, I personally lean FDR.
I think FDR is probably my I think is probably the better president, and I know it in my heart, but I feel like I'm too romantic. I feel like Teddy is the more romantic option, and like that part of me would rather see Teddy, but I think I would be okay with FDR going into the top tier. I think FDR it was a much. I think it's a much. He's holding like I think a much heavier crown than Teddy is. I think there's a lot more that he got us through specifically.
That's probably a good way to phrase it. And I mean, both did have some major failures, especially on like constitutionality and civil rights. But I think they were in eras where that was going to happen.
Yeah,
It's hard to judge because especially like when we go into like these early presidents and we have to talk about slavery or civil rights, I'm sure there will be something that we are going to bump down, like Biden and Obama for in 100 years because that we just don't think about right now that they never bothered thinking of.
right.
So that leaves us with our top five being FDR, Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt, and Eisenhower.
I think that's reasonable.
Our next portion is Monroe, Polk, HW, and Truman. Our kind of runner-ups for then best president of all time would probably be from these three of Jefferson, LBJ, and Taft.
I will say I do think it does feel weird to me that I guess I don't know. It does feel weird to me that like that HW is like within like the top 10. I guess I don't know enough about him personally. I think I would have to do like more.
I mean, I just do personally like him because I am like in lockstep with him on his foreign policy. But I'd be willing to bump him down to B plus and bump Jefferson up if you'd want to.
I think that's probably. I think. Nah, I think I like the take more.
The hot takes.
Yeah, I think it makes the list more unique.
The spicy takes. I think Polk being as prominent as he is, I think is also a bit spicy to some people. It also leaves our bottom of Buchanan, Johnson. Those are kind of like gimmies. Tyler, H.W. Bush aren't too controversial with people with our politics. The real hot take for bottom presidents is probably Cleveland, but just looking at his second administration, devoid of his first, I really did not see much I liked. And I think it's understandable why he got absolutely, like the Democrats got absolutely bodied in 1896, despite going up against McKinley of all people.
Absolutely.
I think Trump was a bit higher than a lot of people usually put him.
Yeah.
Or at least people who dislike him, because then there's always the people who put him in S tier for some reason.
I think this position actually this is the exact position I was thinking for him. I've always felt like it's more been about him as the person than like anything really, especially he's done.
Yeah. Well. Oh.
All right.
I guess that's it. You were right. This did take about just 4 hours.
Just about?
Yeah, just about 4 hours. It is 3 hours 48 minutes in.
I think I'm pretty happy with this list, honestly, looking at it.
Yeah. So now next time what we got to do is we got to rank all the vice presidents.
I can't name like more than 5 probably.
Neither can I. How about we do all the fictional presidents? Like all in random media. Like we got the guy from Monsters vs. Aliens versus the guy in Independence Day who handled First Contact better.
And then bring back Nixon. from Futurama.
Futurama Nixon versus regular. Futurama Nixon is like just a W, you know. I think Futurama Nixon, because I mean, it's the ultimate comeback story. That's got to be S tier at least.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
What was it? Who's the president in like what's it? Idiocracy. I think that guy's A tier.
Who is that?
He's just some muscle bound dude who just got elected because he's cool.
Oh yeah, it's the guy Terry Crews plays, the Old Spice guy. All right. I think. Are we good to call it?
I think so. I mean, there's not really much else to go over. I mean, we got all 46 presidents. Most people don't even do all 46.
Yeah. All right. Just make sure DM me this picture also,
Oh, I will.
and also save the live stream and stuff.
Oh yeah, live stream will be saved, obviously.
Okay.
Okay, and now everyone look forward to the future Reagan versus Kingpin rap battle, which I am now announcing for him, so he has to make it. That is guaranteed now. You cannot stop it. It must happen. Good night,
yes.
Tri-State. Good night, Tri-State area.
Bye.